Jay Forrester attended one of the early meetings in Rome, and he said, we can do that when they talked about what were the factors, what were the risks, and what did they want to look at. He said, we can do that. And then Volkswagen and George Mitchell and some others began to fund this. And so a group including Dennis and Donella Meadows were chosen in Boston at MIT, where we are now in Boston, and assembled a group of workers and tens of others. I want to read something that Dana Meadows said that John Richardson has brought out to us at the end of her study of 10 different global models spurred on by the limits to growth, and her concept in Groping in the Dark, which is the name of another book she wrote, is the current condition of the globe is intolerable, and we make it so. It is changing because of what we decide. It could be beautiful if only we would decide to get along together, to open to each other, and open to new ways of thinking. Remember what's really important to us and what's less so, and live our lives for those things that are the most important. Maybe it's worth thinking another way, as if we cared and counted, even if that is just groping in the dark. So that's what this conference is like and about in Boston today. We start our journey with Dennis Meadows, the partner in Limits to Growth. And we listen to a series of impact assessment of Limits to Growth, including our dear sister who says she has gone virtual, Hazel Henderson, which happened last Sunday. And we then look at the Voyagers Club of Rome group, who's been exploring and valuing what's important to us and leads us to actions of well-being. We hope to emerge in the light to live our lives by moving ourselves and the world into a world of well-being. In this conference, we will hear Mamphela's vision for the future, who is a very important woman's voice beyond Donella Meadows. Mamphela has created and lived through a real transformation of values created by the social movement she, Steve Biko, other medical students made in the threat of a bloody revolution, which turned out not to be so bloody. So we'll stop for a moment to acknowledge Hazel. And now we want, come with us on our vision of a new world from the Club of Rome's Association of the New World. And I want to give welcomes by Jean Doherty and by hopefully Sylvia Zimmerman, but Sylvia hasn't shown. Oh, there she is. Hello, Sylvia. Jean is the president of the Canadian Club of Rome. Jean?
Thank you, Anitra, and I would like to welcome everybody to this fabulous conference that will be honoring the publication of the Limits to Growth, the 50th anniversary of this publication, looking at and using systems modeling to try and explain what we are seeing and what we might see into the future. Systems modeling has been extremely important in this work and is ongoing. And the Canadian Core, Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, has continued with some of our systems modelers, people like Rob Hoffman, who have been integral in making sure that this information and systems modeling is used for predicting into the future, something that we all need to look at. So again, welcome to everybody, and thank you, Anitra, for organizing this.
Thank you, Jean. Sylvia, from the Argentine chapter of the Club of Association Club of Rome.
Thank you, Anitra. It's a great initiative to join us all together. And I would like to welcome, since it's the Western Hemisphere that is hosting this encounter, this meeting, I would like to welcome you all to this meeting with some words from a great, great American poet, and that expresses the spiritual dimension of our continent, of our people. And I would like to say, quote, Walt Whitman saying, "Do not let this day end without having grown a little, without being happy, without having risen our dreams. Do not let ourselves be overcome by disappointment." So be very welcome to you all to this beautiful ceremony and celebration. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. And now Brian is going to lead us into Dennis Meadows, who is traveling between countries at this particular moment in time, but has recorded a very interesting message for us, followed by a series of 9 messages, which are the impact of limits to growth, both in the futures world, and John Richardson and Hunter will talk about Dana as a person, and then some regional assessments. Go ahead.
My spirit is in with you. My body is at the moment traveling between Toulouse, France, and Amsterdam, Netherlands, where I'll spend the weekend with some colleagues engaged in strategic planning meetings. I'm thankful to Anitra and others in the association for making it possible for me to join you, even if by video. I'm recording this 2 months before the program that you're enjoying today. I guess that's the good thing about studying 200-year trends. I don't think my conclusions are going to change very much over the next 2 months. And the momentous events which are going on right now, the war in Ukraine, confirmation hearing for the Supreme Court Justice, all nations struggling to cope with their debt and so forth. These things will evolve, of course, over the next 2 months. But again, in the overall scheme of things, they're not going to have a big impact. So I'm confident about what I have to say today. In any event, Anitra asked me to speak about the past, to reflect on some of the critical steps and decisions in the Limits to Growth project. And of course, those aren't going to change. So today, I'm going to be talking to you about critical steps in the Limits to Growth project. As I've often said to interviewers who ask me about what happened 50 years ago, be cautious. Memory is selective, and people tend to remember some things and forget others. So I will only present this as my own reflections on the past, not as a literal history. There are many histories written by Club of Rome members about the early days, and this will be a compliment. So again, for the USA Club of Rome Association on the 27th, please, if you would. I still remember the first presentation of our book in 1972, March 2nd. It was down at the Smithsonian Institution, the old castle in Washington, D.C. We were brought there by Potomac Associates. Bill Deedle, the president of Potomac, and the publisher of our book, as you see on the right-hand side of the podium. Myself and the senior members of the team were there. You see from left to right, Bill Behrens, Jorgen Wanders, Aurelio Pache, myself, Donella is just peeking out. You can see her a little bit to the right of the podium, and then Bill Deedle. I wouldn't say terrified, but I was very concerned going into that meeting, because it seemed to me that the main things I had to say were completely obvious. to everybody. And I was afraid people would begrudge the time that they had spent to come together in Washington for a presentation and discussion of our results. But I didn't need to worry. Those things which we thought were perfectly obvious are still being hotly debated, in many cases ignored today. So all I can say is not that we finished the discussion in 1972, but I think we certainly got it going. We had, as you know, at the behest of the Club of Rome, created a model to help us understand the long-term causes and consequences of physical growth on this planet. It was an optimistic model in many ways. It showed that there was a possibility for humanity to take drastic action and be left with a more or less sustainable situation. Well, the term sustainable development has over 100 meanings. We give it more or less the one which it has come to hold through the use of Mamphela and his colleagues, who have created the so-called ecological footprint concept, looking at the rate which humanity draws resources out of the planet in comparison with the rate that they're regenerating. But in 1972, Mamphela and his work lay still far in the future. He and Bill Rees, his doctoral advisor, did that work in the early 1990s. Our third edition of the book actually collaborated with Mamphela, but in the first at the scenario is a projection of what could happen under the best of circumstances. It's impossible to predict the future, of course, because humanity monitors events and then responds in ways that we can't predict now. So instead of making one specific future, we laid out 12 different possible scenarios. Some like this, quite attractive. Others, unfortunately, showing overshoot and collapse. If one didn't undertake the fairly drastic changes in policies that we discussed in 1972, then our expectation was that over the next 50 years, there would continue to be growth. But in the early part of this century, more or less around now, between now and 2050, the dominant growth trends would start to sputter because of lack of physical resources. And the result would be decline. This being the more spectacular of our scenarios, it of course came to be the one which defined the work of the Club of Rome in the mind of the public. This scenario has been studied more recently by a number of independent observers. For example, Graham Turner, who works down at the Commonwealth Scientific Industrial Research Organization in Australia. It's their national laboratory. And in comparing this standard scenario with recent historical data, he said, unfortunately, the data review continues to confirm that the standard run scenario represents real world outcomes considerably well. That's from an article he published in Gaia in 2012, page 123 is quoted. More recently, a number of other analysts have reached the same conclusion. So here we are. We've come now really to the end of the forecast period that we dealt with between 1970 and 2020. We were careful in our book never to make any statements about the behavior of variables past the peak, because we knew that decline would bring a lot of political, economic, social, psychological changes into the play, and our model certainly didn't have those incorporated, and so it was no longer a basis for making any kind of useful statements. I know the Club of Rome is now starting midway in a new project for all. Mamphela will tell you about it later. And let's hope that it can give us some insights about what comes next. What I'll do today is simply look back at the derivation of these and other scenarios and try to reflect on some of the major steps. Let me say in the outset, of course, that nobody in 1972 imagined that we were engaged in a project which would still continue to be the source of discussion 50 years later, nor one that would attract as much attention as it did. So none of us were making these decisions in the context of the big picture. But looking back, I can tell you what happened. Aurelio formed the club in 1968. A group of members responding to a speech that he had written, assembled with him in Rome, and out of that emerged the so-called intellectual think tank. One member of that group was Ugo Timon, who was the director of a large research institute just outside of Geneva. Another member was Eric Jantsch, who had worked with Alexander King. And Eric Jantsch introduced Hassan Azbakan, a professor at the Wharton School in Philadelphia at those times. And it was decided that Hassan would create a project for the club, which would be housed at Ugo's institute. So Hassan wrote up a proposal. Another member of the Club of Rome, Edouard Pastel, was on the board of directors of the Volkswagen Foundation, and he pushed them to provide support. But in 1970, the board of the Volkswagen Foundation decided not to provide the $900,000 that Hassan was asking for. Instead, they said, here's $20,000, $30,000, go off, do a preliminary study and see if you can come back with something that's a little more solid. So that led to the Club of Rome meeting in Bern in June of 1970 to understand what to do next. Quite by accident, at that meeting, Jay Forrester was invited. He elaborated on his ideas. They were attractive to the Club of Rome. And as a result, Jay invited the Club of Rome Executive Committee to come to MIT. I think it was a great testimony to those people that they were willing to set aside that time on fairly short notice. We're talking about people like Saburo Okita, the finance minister, former finance minister of Japan, Alexander King, who had been a science advisor to OECD, and Aurelio and others, of course. They came, and on the way home, Jay created not on the back of a napkin, but on a piece of paper, a crude diagram of a model which he thought might be the basis for a little teaching program. He called it World One. And when he got home, he quickly converted it into computer equations, made some runs. And I still remember Monday morning, the day after Jay had returned, coming back to MIT. I'd been gone for a year, Donella and I, on a long trip. And hearing Jay describe the meeting and lay out his basic ideas and his plans. The club came. I was the director of a teaching program for them. And in the course of the week, I developed a little 3-4 page proposal about what we could do using Jay's methods for a study. And late one night, the club executive committee met in private session and decided to switch. So they packed up Hassan, he flew home, and I was given the seed funds, assembled the team, and started to work. After about a month, we were able to provide a more refined proposal to the Volkswagen Foundation. And on that basis, they provided additional funding. We began our work thinking that our goal was to create a very large scientific model and scientific documentation for it. We took our preliminary work up to a meeting of the Club of Rome, which was organized by the Canadians at Montebello, just outside of Ottawa, Canada. And in April 1971, presented our preliminary results. I still remember being totally frustrated and puzzled by the questions we got, because those ideas, which had seemed obvious to me at the Smithsonian, were not obvious a year later to the Club of Rome itself. And so when we flew home back to Cambridge, I remember saying to Donella, you know, we need a little memo that at least lays out some of the basic definitions, so we don't have to spend our time during the formal presentation defining all of these trivial concepts: exponential growth, linear growth, physical limits, the role of technological advance, things like that. So Donella, who was a superb writer, set out and created a 12-page memorandum with the basic definitions. We sent that out to Pache. It was circulated widely in the club, and in a great surprise to us, came back mainly with criticisms, objections, and questions. So I remember talking with Donella and saying, okay, it's going to be 30-page memo on the basic definitions. She did that. We sent it out again. Again, it came back with innumerable questions, criticisms, objections. And finally, her brief memo had grown to be about 125 pages. At which point, Aurelio came on the scene, looked at the draft and said, you know, this is what we need, not the scientific report. And so we decided to publish it. Unfortunately, the original budget didn't contain any money for printing or distributing this informal report. Luckily, I remembered meeting two guys, Bill Deedle and his colleague from a little think tank down in Washington called Potomac Associates. I called them up and asked if they might like to take this on as a project, and they did. As a result, they provided good editorial assistance and then subsidized a significant public relations campaign. We started to disseminate the report, which rather quickly took off and finally was published in probably 35 languages and about 3.5 million copies. The team was 17 people. I brought them in from the Cambridge community. Boston, Cambridge has an absolutely phenomenal intellectual and literary treasure of information. 35 colleges, universities, and community colleges there. So drawing on my MIT students, on professional colleagues from Harvard and elsewhere, we put together a team, and it's listed as shown here in Feminist to Growth. The overwhelming asset that we had going into the work was the conceptualization that Jay Forrester had sketched out on his way back to the United States, that very crude model, World 1. I'll come back to that in just a moment. But working with that, my team and I, here, me and Eric Zahn, a German student, sent over by one of the early Club of Rome members, Gerd Kurzfleisch, are discussing a part of the model. The main team, of course, was, as left to right, Jorgen Landers, Jay Forrester, who passed away in 2016, Donella, who unfortunately passed in 2001, myself, and Bill Behrens. Jorgen, you know, he's still active in the club. Bill quickly left the team and through a variety of different occupations, finally founded and then became president of the largest solar energy firm in New England. Now, with many offices, hundreds of people, it installs much of the thermal and photovoltaic energy panels that you see in the Northeast. Bill remains a close friend. Unfortunately, far away up in Maine, he recently retired. We started with World One. Legend has it that Jay sketched this on a napkin on the plane flight back. That's actually not true, but it was in any event a fairly crude model. These notations have enormous meaning for anybody skilled in system dynamics. For others, mainly they show the level of detail. You see already the principal stocks, population, pollution, agriculture, natural resources, capital investment, and the various decisions that cause them to increase or decrease over time. Once he got home, Jay converted that slightly into a more formal representation, World 2, and this became the basis for our work. We elaborated on this. The problem is, as you'll see, that Jay, although brilliantly incisive, was not professionally persuasive. And it was our job to explore, adapt, test, elaborate, and document to the point where it would become a legitimate scientific tool. The results finally of our work was something called World 3. Still the same sectors, but now much more elaborated. These models became the basis for 4 books. First book was World Dynamics. That was written by Jay himself, published in 1971. It lays out the basic ideas and conclusions from World 2. I explained already that as we began to elaborate on that model, we developed the Limits to Growth report, which appeared in 1972. Donella actually wrote the book. I provided significant editorial assistance. Jorgen and Bill were graduate students of ours, and we added their names to the book so that they would benefit from that professionally, and it turned out to be a great success. Both of them went on to important careers. In Germany, we put 2 other names on the book, Erickson and Peter Milling, and they, with that boost, eventually became tenured professors in Germany and had a very distinguished careers. The third book was a collection of papers which we had written in the course of doing the work, edited by me and Donella, but with authorship from a number of people, including Jay Forrester, appeared in 1973, and remains, in my mind, still an extremely interesting and relevant compilation of ideas. Then finally, in 1974, long after the formal completion of our project, I managed to get out the scientific work, which was initially the main purpose of the project. It's interesting to look at the evolution of these books as you go along. World Dynamics was relatively brief and had just a few citations, most of them to Jay Forrester. The rest, except one, to his colleagues at MIT, and one urban planner that Jay liked a lot also got a citation. Enough for him to create a groundbreaking theory, but not enough to persuade anybody else that it was a professionally legitimate work. 1972 came out Limits to Growth. Now it's 205 pages with 56 citations. Toward Global Equilibrium, a bit bigger, many citations, but of course for different, completely independent articles. And then finally, our scientific report, 637 pages, 337 citations. I've often said the time I spent getting this book out exceeds probably the sum of all the time spent by everybody in the world who ever read it. It was published in 2 or 3 languages and is still available today as an interesting reference. So what did these books tell us? Well, it's interesting to look at the evolution of our work over the last 50 years. In 1972, basically, we said that the present growth policies for global material consumption can't continue. Notice we're using the term policies, not trends. One of the biggest misunderstandings of our work was that we were somehow extrapolating out trends, as, for example, Malthus had done. No, we simply said that if people continue to have the same goal, process the same information, use the same resources, they would produce outputs, which for the moment manifest as exponential growth, but eventually become unsustainable. We said that the result of those policies is most likely overshoot of the planetary carrying capacity and collapse. But as I showed in my earlier scenario, a sustainable society is still possible. And then we said, sooner humanity pursues the latter option, the greater chance of success. And actually, a number of our scenarios showed what would happen if those same equilibrium policies, which were quite successful in 1972, were implemented later. They tended still to stabilize things, but the options were much less. Now, unfortunately, we didn't do that. And we have 2022 looking at us. What are the conclusions I would put forward now? These are kind of the end point of my analysis and the beginning point, I hope, for what the Club of Rome will do next. Now we say the levels of global material consumption cannot continue. Those policies have taken population, food consumption, material use, energy use up to levels which can't continue. The red is the only change in that 1972 first conclusion. The most likely result now is a sudden decline, but a gradual descent is still possible. Before we said most likely result is overshooting and collapse, but we might be sustainable. Now we say sustainability is no longer an option, but our collapse can be slow or fast. And once again, the sooner humanity pursues the latter option, the greater the chance of success. So what are the options? Well, in 1972, we showed that with appropriate policies, a more or less sustainable future was available. But that if we didn't make those changes, we'd see something very different, overshoot and decline. Now it's 2022, we didn't make those changes. We have overshot. And at this point, the options are either a gradual decline or what Ugo Bardi has coined the Seneca effect, a fairly rapid decline. So to put it in other words, 50 years later, it's no longer about slow down, but about get back down. That gives us a new set of priorities. Some have called this a prophet of doom. For me, it's very different. I was asked the other day if I'm a pessimist or a realist, an optimist, and I said, I'm neither. I'm a realist. I look at the options we have and try to figure out how to get realize the best of them. As my mother used to tell me, if you're playing a card game, don't sit there wishing you had different cards. Get busy trying to figure out how to make the best of the cards that you've got. So what does that leave us? Well, it gives us some new priorities, which are of interest to me, but lay outside the scope of our original analysis. First, it's time to acknowledge the reality that society evolves. Things go up, things go down. The Roman rose and fall, the Phoenicians, the Mongols, the Aztecs, the Han Dynasty. So it would be really the height of stupidity and even arrogance to imagine somehow this industrial civilization that we've created on the planet is going to be proof from what has been the case for the last 300,000 years of our planet. Doing that will give us much more interest in nature's regenerative capacities, because those finally are the resource stream within which we have to live. Our current use of fossil fuels, our current erosion of fertile soils, you can imagine these as something like a bank account that was saved up for a long time. Now you're spending it down. Eventually, you're going to have to adjust your lifestyle so that it accommodates to the rate at which you are putting money into your bank. And that's nature's regenerative capacity. That's the focus of Montesquieu and his ecological footprint. To do that, we really need a new vision. And if I could put my finger on a single leverage point where the club or others could have a major impact on the future of society, it would be in getting people to understand that sustainability could be an interesting, exciting, satisfying state for our society. For some reason, we have come to be focused on the notion that a young population and ever-growing use of material and energy are good, and anything else is bad. Recently, I was talking with an economist friend, and I said, you know, we need to go back to a energy consumption, maybe half of current levels. Oh, he said, you're talking about the Stone Age. And I said, no, I'm talking about the United States in the 50s. We were using half as much energy per person back then. And I remember it as a very pleasant phase of society. We now use growth as a way of avoiding confronting many options. Again, debt is justified if you think you'll have more wealth later. Social security programs and retirement programs are justified if you think that you'll be producing more later. We won't. And now we need to be realistic and start understanding how to deal with our problems in a period where society is constant or declining and aging, and we're gradually readjusting our use of materials and energy. It means we're going to need to come up with new and interesting policies for resilience. There are shocks ahead. We're experiencing them now. And to come through that period with resolve and still pursuing our goals, we need to implement measures that will let us deal with, cope with, and get on past those shocks. That's going to mean that we have to increase the time horizon and the geographic concern of decision makers. Nothing could illustrate our current predicament better than, for example, the recent catastrophic policies related to the COVID vaccine. The profit interests of a few companies, the short-term nationalistic interests of a few countries completely dominated the extent to which we produced and shared these crucial reserves. We need to get our leaders out past that. Mamphela is now about to lay out the plan for the Club of Rome in the future. I wish you a very, very productive session. Thank you.
Now we are going to hear from a series of personal friends of Donella Meadows, and then futurists, and finally regional people. And we're glad to welcome all the new participants. Ryan, we're ready for the assessments.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sandrine Dixson-Declève, and I have the esteemed pleasure of being co-chair with Mamphela, who is with you today. And I also am the chair of the Economic and Societal Impacts Research and Innovation Working Group at the European Commission level. And also I'm working with the European Commission and other policymakers across the globe in putting in place actually sustainability, climate, and new finance policy. And I'm very pleased to be asked to address you today. I wish that I could be there in person, but you're in very good hands. What I'd like to say is that the importance of this seminal report, which was released in 1972, The Limits to Growth, has not, unfortunately, done the job that it should have 50 years ago. Those messages that are so important in the limits, which indicated that actually there were no limits to well-being, and there was no limit actually to ensuring that humanity could live safely on the planet. But where there was a limit was that society could not continue at the pace that it was moving forward in terms of both overconsumption and population growth and the way in which it was using natural resources for production that was actually creating an economy and a system that was going far beyond the planetary boundaries. Today, 50 years later, we ask ourselves, how did we get here? And as an environmental scientist, it is difficult to respond to the voice of the youth asking, what have you done over the last 50 years? Clearly, the Club of Rome and other organizations that have been here for the last 50 years have tried to alert policymakers and citizens and business leaders to the importance of understanding systems and understanding how we could truly come back to a safety zone within the planet. Some of the key messages that have been very much expressed over the last few years have been those that we cannot be separate from nature, that actually humanity is part of nature. And once humanity places a value on nature and places on value on what is most important in society, then maybe we can get out of this mess. This mess, which actually, again, was predicted by those esteemed scientists at MIT, who very much already communicated that by the 2020s, we would have a series of crisis moments. Those crisis moments that we have now are clearly the culmination of the health pandemic, climate change, and also conflict. Conflict not only on the border of Europe, but across the globe. So what were the positive impacts that we can see from the limits? What we can see from the limits to growth is that coming out of the 70s, we had the greatest amount of new legislation. And this also was due to the Stockholm Plus 50 conference, which started to look at some very important aspects of moving beyond the planetary boundaries. The need to address ozone through the Montreal Protocol, the need to address radioactive waste and also radioactivity in general due to nuclear explosions such as Chernobyl, and then of course Fukushima and others. The need to look at chemicals once we had Bhopal and other types of very key issues coming from the use of chemicals. So from an environmental legislation and policy perspective, since the 1970s, we have evolved. But we haven't evolved in terms of systems thinking. We haven't evolved in terms of policymakers and decision makers going beyond short-term profits and short-term decision making and truly thinking through how they can optimize different types of systems in order to ensure that they service people's lives and livelihoods, that they service not only people, but people, planet, and prosperity at the same time. This is where we need to now bring on the alarm bells and ensure that people understand at all levels of society, whether it be national decision makers, international decision makers, or local decision makers, or citizens, that actually we can emerge from emergency if we really put systems thinking on overdrive. Systems thinking that has been promoted by the Club of Rome, but started very much at the heart of what Dana Meadows has been telling us as the queen of systems. The way in which we can look at leverage points to ensure that we truly make a difference. How can we bring in those levers now at a time when we're in the midst of chaos and plan for the long term and put in place the right short-term levers that will make a difference? The tax incentive schemes, the insurance that we are protecting people's lives and livelihoods and not individual wealth. Those are the levers that we now need to think about. These are part of the turnarounds that we're thinking through in terms of our next publication, Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity, one that takes into consideration poverty, inequality, empowerment, and how those three are so important to ensure that we have access to food and energy across the globe. So I wish you very healthy and continuous discussions. And I know that with Anitra and the rest of the team in North America representing the Club of Rome as well as Mamphela, you will be in incredibly good hands and we'll have a rich conversation. Thank you.
Limits to Growth was published the year I graduated college. I read it, of course, and committed to strive to see how the woes of the world and their solutions are all interrelated, if we can but understand the systems that keep them in place. This was perhaps the greatest contribution of Limits to Growth, and of Donella Meadows, whom I knew as Dana, who did the actual writing of the book. Such a gifted writer. Limits, then Beyond the Limits, were brilliant books. People say that they didn't change anything, but that's wrong. Some of the warnings in the book have not yet come to pass because enough people took them seriously and put in place measures to forestall the worst of the possible outcomes. I miss Dana every day. Most of all, she never gave up. Many around her got depressed and more or less gave up. But Dana always believed humanity could save itself, that we could create a finer future. The thing that I most remember about Dana is her kindness to everyone, always. Such an eminent scholar, but always kind, loving. In Beyond the Limits, she began to speak of love. She said, "We don't underestimate the gravity of the changes that will take the present world down from overshoot and into sustainability. We think a transition to a sustainable world is technically and economically possible, but we know that it is psychologically and politically daunting. The necessary changes would constitute a revolution, not in the sense of political revolution, but more in the profound sense of changing the foundations of human self-definitions, institutions, and cultures. It is not a revolution that can be planned or dictated. It won't follow a list of fiats from a government or from computer modelers. The sustainability revolution, if it happens, will be organic and evolutionary. It will arise from the visions, insights, experiments, and actions of billions of people. It will require every human quality and skill, from technical ingenuity, economic entrepreneurism, and political leadership, to honesty, compassion, and love. Are any of the necessary changes from resource efficiency to human compassion really possible? The general cynicism of the day would say there's not a chance. That cynicism, of course, is a mental model. The truth is that no one knows. The world faces not a preordained future, but a choice. The choice between models. One model says that this finite world, for all practical purposes, has no limits. Choosing that model will take us even further beyond the limits, and we believe to collapse in the first half of the 21st century. Another model says that the limits are real and close, and that there is not enough time, and that people cannot be moderate or responsible or compassionate. That model is self-fulfilling. If we choose to believe it, we will get to be right. A third model says that the limits are real and close, and there is just exactly enough time with no time to waste. There is just exactly enough energy, enough material, enough money, enough environmental resilience, and enough human virtue to bring about a revolution to a better world. That model might be wrong. All evidence we have seen, from the world data to the global computer models, suggests it might be right. There is no way of knowing for sure, other than to try it. A colleague, lamenting that Dana had declined to come to some meeting or other, observing that she had already exceeded her carbon budget for the year, insisted that he couldn't carry the message alone. Dana replied, "You need to pull out of yourselves whatever it is that you admire or rely on in us. It's in you too, and in every person in your audience. It's all over the universe. The only trick is to keep ourselves in touch with it. Love, Dana."
I'm John Richardson, Professor Emeritus of International Development, School of International Service, American University, Washington, D.C. Many years ago, I taught and had management responsibilities in the School of Engineering, Case Western Reserve University, where I worked with Professors Mihailo Masarovich and Barry Hughes on the global model described in Mankind at the Turning Point. Our global modeling work brought me to the Luxembourg, Austria-based International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, which we referred to by its initials, IIASA, pronounced YASA. Donella and Dennis, too, were spending time working at YASA on various projects. Led by a senior professor, Gerhard Bruckmann, YASA began to hold periodic global modeling, excuse me, I was checking my screen. Led by a senior Austrian professor, Gerhard Bruckmann, YASA began to hold periodic global modeling conferences in 1974 to assess new contributions in the field. I want to tell you how Donella Meadows, by her contributions, inspired and contributed to a very special book about global modeling that differed from many of her other books and also, I believe, was self-revealing. The book was entitled Groping in the Dark, the First Decade of Global Modeling. It culminated a process by which teams developing new global models were invited to present their work at YASA to a growing community of global modelers who were engaged in similar endeavors. There had been 5 previous conferences at which 1 or 2 models had been presented. Groping in the Dark reported on the 6th conference, which was a retrospective of the 5 previous conferences held periodically beginning in 1974. The work of the MIT System Dynamics Group, World Dynamics, 1971, The Limits to Growth, 1973, and The Dynamics of Growth in a Finite World, 1974, were also included. After a conference, representatives of each group responded to a detailed questionnaire about their experiences and lessons learned. Having received the questionnaire response and begun to process them, we became convinced that our conference proceedings must avoid the fate of many, dullness. To do so, we chose to emulate a book, Platform for Change, by the iconoclastic systems and management science philosopher Stafford Beer. We highlighted different themes in our book by pages of different colors. Yellow, personal thoughts and reflections. Blue, important conclusions and highlights. Gold, the field of global modeling and its history. White, the actual conference proceedings. Our book title, Groping in the Dark, and an accompanying narrative paraphrased the Idris Shah parable about the man searching for his lost key under the streetlight, rather than at his home where he lost it, because the illumination under the streetlight was better. This was a tongue-in-cheek critique of some other modeling groups that we felt gave greater priority to methodology than to problem solving. Groping in the Dark ends with a prayer written by Donella. The fact that she concluded a book project in which she had invested so much passion and creativity with what could hardly be viewed as other than a prayer showed a facet of her character that she did not so often reveal, her deep spirituality. Her concluding prayer, a portion of which I have excerpted for this presentation, was entitled, "A Final Word About the Globe." And I quote, "The most basic past messages of the global models are not new and should not be surprising. We don't need a computer model to tell us that we must destroy the system on which our sustenance depends, that poverty is wrong and preventable. The exploitation of one person by another degrades both the exploited and the exploiter. That it's better for individuals and nations to cooperate than to fight, that the love we have for all humankind and for future generations should be the same as our love for those close to us. If we do not embrace these principles and live by them, our system will not survive. The future is in our hands and will be no better or worse than we make it." These messages have been around for centuries. They emerge in different forms and now in the outputs of global models. Anything that persists for so long and comes from such diverse sources as gurus and input-output matrices must be coming close to the truth. We all know the truth at some deep level inside ourselves. We only have to look honestly and deeply to find it. But we don't live as if we knew it. Some of us deny messages from the global models. Others try hard not to think about them. Most of us feel helpless, wish that things were otherwise, assume that we can do nothing, and go on living. Meanwhile, on this planet, 28 people starve to death each minute. One species of life disappears every day, and $1 million is spent each minute on armaments. The current condition of our globe is intolerable, and we make it so. It's changing because of what we decide. It could be beautiful if we would only decide to get along together, be open to each other and new ways of thinking. Remember what is really important to us and what is less so, and live our lives for that is most important. As sophisticated, skeptical, scientific Westerners, we always react to such statements by saying, "It sounds too simple and is in fact impossible. How could we decide to get along together? You don't just decide things like that." And how could we get everyone else to decide it? It couldn't be possible that everyone else is just like us and saying the same thing. when everyone is so sophisticated that they can't believe it could be simple to be honest and to care, and everyone is so smart that they know they don't count, so they never try. You've got the kind of world we've got. Maybe it's worth thinking another way, as if we cared, as if we counted, even if it's just groping in the dark.
Hello, everyone. I'm Barry Hughes, professor at the University of Denver and the founding director of the Pardee Center for International Futures, also at the university. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here via this recording, to be able to help celebrate the 50th anniversary of the release of the Limits to Growth volume and of the model underlying that work. Nothing has really reshaped my own life more than that volume and that model. In 1972, about the time of its release, Mike Masarovich and Edward Pestel were putting together a small group of people to make the second report of the Club of Rome, in which they were members, and that became known as Mankind at the Turning Point. I was fortunate enough to become a member of that team and to contribute to that work. As I said, nothing has reshaped my own life more than doing that, because I went on to develop another computer simulation world model called International Futures, capitals I, F, small s, that emphasizes through that name the if-then character of our interaction with our future and our ability to help reshape it. The International Futures model, along with some other models in what has come to be known as the integrated assessment modeling world, have increasingly had a policy orientation, trying to help us identify ways in which we can improve that future. In the International Futures Project, we have worked through the model online and downloadable freely with a variety of international organizations like the United Nations Development Program, African Union's new Partnership for African Development, with national governments, with international organizations, to help understand, and by understanding, also through policy analysis, to help improve the futures that we collectively shape. Our work has become tied to the Sustainable Development Goals, and those goals cut across human development, including the food provision, hunger reduction that was already important in thinking about limits to growth, but also education, health improvement, poverty reduction. Beyond human development, social improvement, including governance enhancement, both domestic and international, to help us deal with these issues, and of course, environmental sustainability. In working across these areas, I think we have actually developed tools now, thanks again, foundationally to Limits to Growth work, that will in fact, and are in fact, beginning to help us address the great challenges we face. I am actually more optimistic, perhaps than I was 50 years ago, than many others, perhaps also in the integrated assessment modeling community, that we can address these issues. And it wouldn't have happened in my mind without that foundational work, without setting off this continued development of tools and support systems and attention to these issues. So again, congratulations on the 50th anniversary. It's been a wonderful part of my own life, and it is, in my mind, improving the world. Take care, everyone.
Happy anniversary, Club of Rome. You were the most important book that was produced on the future since Future Shock. Future Shock was the first thing that made everybody aware the change was going to be here forever. And the Club of Rome's book on the limits to growth was the next major change, saying we can't do business as usual or we'll be toast. And it was also the first bringing to the world attention the idea of global systems analysis to understand the planet as a whole. The only trouble is it tended to say, don't grow. Well, you can't tell that to poor countries. That's not quite fair, because they go, look, you guys, you rich countries, you got all this growth, you got all this money, and now you're telling us not to do anything. So then the next phase was to say, okay, what's smart growth? What's intelligent growth? How do we mature as a species to not be so stupid? And we're now in that transition from the sort of stupid growth to more intelligent growth. And so congratulations, Club of Rome, for your role in this transition.
Start when you're ready.
Hello, this is Hazel Henderson, and I'm a colleague of all of our friends at Club of Rome. I'm now an honorary member the last few years, and basically I have written many books about what Aurelio Peccei always called the global problematique. And basically, I was a friend of Aurelio Peccei, and I sent a video that of a conversation that he and I had in Caracas, Venezuela, back in 1983, and I've sent that to the Club of Rome office. And I've resent it today because it indicates that although I was a friend of Aurelio Peccei, and he had read my books and all of that, I was not invited to be a member of the Club of Rome. Neither, of course, was Dana Meadows even, because back in those days, it was men only. It was way back in the patriarchy. So, of course, the limits to growth, I wrote a review of it in The Futurist when it first came out in 1972, and I knew it was going to be enormously influential. Economists totally misunderstood it. They didn't realize that it was a future scenario, set of scenarios. And recently I have an article called Economists Learning from Futurists. Finally, they're learning that their narrow economic forecasting has been a total disaster, all based on the price system. And no one knows the price of anything now. And people are making up asset classes out of thin air. Basically, prices have always been a function of human ignorance because we've permitted externalities, that kind of fraud in the accounting. So even though limits to growth was so totally trashed by the economics profession, of course, its scenarios turned out to be extremely prophetic and still are today. And so basically, my personal experiences since after my first book called Creating Alternative Futures, The End of Economics and the Politics of the Solar Age, which nobody understood when it came out in 1981. You see the cover behind my shoulder there. But now suddenly, all of this, I think, due to the pandemic and all of the current issues we're dealing with, suddenly people are waking up to the fact that we have to go in a completely new direction. And this is what I'm spending most of my time on now. And so I think I've probably almost run out my few minutes, but in any case, what I see coming now is an era really of feminist philosophy, economics, and even as we see in Germany today, where the foreign minister and the two assistant ministers in the German cabinet are women. and they are talking about feminist foreign policy. Certainly can't be any worse than what our brothers have done over the past 1,000 years. So what I'm looking for is bringing back the age-old recognition of our mutual interdependence on this planet. Do as you would be done by, the golden, basically the golden rule. And we live by that for thousands of years. If you go on Wikipedia, there's 50 pages on the golden rule. And this is outside of economics and toward acknowledgement of our mutual interdependence. We are one species along with all other species on this planet. And our true condition is we all survive with the free photons from our mother star, the sun. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Dear friends, it's an honor for me to participate in this 50th anniversary of Limits to Growth. I would like to talk about the impact in Mexico and Latin America. In 1968, the Club of Rome was founded. In 1972, Limits to Growth is published, and the book was translated to Spanish by the Fondo de Cultura Económica because of the initiative of Professor Víctor Urquidi, who was the president of El Colegio de México and a founding member of the Club of Rome. The context now is the UN 2030 Agenda, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the 2015 Paris Agreement, and now Glasgow, the common, our latest inform to the Club of Rome. And the context in Latin America is that we live in a growing inequality, permanent poverty, destruction of the nature and ecosystems, corruption and impunity, and a weakening of democracy in the region. The global agenda now is a climate change crisis, the planetary boundaries, the impact of these problems on emerging economies, the need of sustainable development. We need growth unlinked to nature destruction, and we need to combat in Latin America the unequal income and wealth distribution and preserve the environment. Latin America needs progress and welfare in a regenerative economy. We live in the Anthropocene, the climate change crisis, with unsustainable population growth. In the fourth industrial revolution, we need a new enlightenment. Latin America needs to arrive on time to the contemporary agenda. We need action in two sides. At the national level, the increase of the democratic rule of law, and at the international level, a new international order, global governance, overcome a global economy controlled by financial speculation, and to face global risks like COVID-19 pandemic, the Russian invasion to Ukraine, the planetary boundaries. Limits to Growth is fully current in Mexico and Latin America. Thank you.
Hello, I am Gonzalo del Castillo. I'm a political scientist specialized in environmental issues and the current executive director of the Argentina chapter of the Club of Rome. First of all, I would like to thank you very much to the United States chapter of the Club of Rome for inviting us to be present in this important meeting to share some ideas and reflection with you in the commemoration of the 50 years of the report Limits to Growth. Well, from my point of view, Limits to Growth marked a before and after in the history of environmentalism and in the struggle for the understanding and definition of some concepts that I believe are still in conflict even today. And the main one is probably the very concept of development. Limits to Growth was perhaps the main trigger to start seriously asking ourselves what development really is, and even more what it should be. And also it allows us to understand and in certain way also to take responsibility for the possible impact that the triumph of certain model of development over others could have on the future of humanity. Finally, the limits to growth 50 years ago reinforced the idea of the freedom with which human beings have to choose their destiny, giving us like a framework of the possible impact that the choice of certain decisions could have over others. And last but not least, the report also reinforced the fact that there are not predetermined fates, but rather like multiple paths that can lead us either to a comprehensive and sustained human development over time, or also to a collapse of civilization with an abrupt decline of human well-being. In any case, it emerged that it depended then, and it depends even more today, on our exclusive responsibility, and also on our freedom to choose a way to act as individuals, and even more important, also to act as a global society. Personally, the report deeply changed the way I understand the global challenges associated with, and even more derived from, our current development model, which, despite having passed 50 years of the report, I believe is still completely a linear model, and therefore dissociated from reality and from the biophysical laws that govern the functioning of our planetary system. And if not that, at least it is dissociated, our current model, of the harmonious functioning that prevailed during the last 1,000 years. So personally, Limits to Growth motivated me to move from theoretical data analysis to the field of practical action. I believe that the last 50 years have been very prosperous in terms of projection, reports, and scientific data and studies that confirm how bad we are. And all those reports have given us certainty about how our development model is destroying the climatic balance, exterminating biological diversity, and also destroying cultural diversities. We have known that for at least 50 years. And since then, we know it with the technical solidity that science gives us. So I believe that it's evident that all the scientific information and warnings are not enough to correct the path of self-destruction in which we are mired. And in this sense, for me, Limit to Growth was like a call to action. Basically, because it allowed me to understand that all the projected destiny is not written, but depends a lot on the decision we can make. And in the current times, perhaps the most important decision we can take is a decision to act. And for this reason, from the Club of Rome in Argentina 5 years ago, we have changed the foundation strategy. And we are dedicated to not only being a think tank, but also to redefining ourselves as an action tank, accompanying the design and implementation of public policies, working with vulnerable communities, accessing water, energy, and food, trying to strengthen the resilience of communities, planting trees, training companies, individuals, and public officials. In sum, we are trying to act in what we can to try to ensure that the projection of the Standard Brand model and the collapse projected by it will finally not prevail for humanity. So once again, I would like to thank you very much on behalf of the Argentinian chapter of the Club of Rome for inviting us to participate in this incredible and important meeting. Thank you very much, and I remain at your disposal.
Right. Hello, I'm Keith Suter. I'm a member of the Club of Rome. I've been involved now for 29 years. I was recruited by Alexander King, one of the founders of the Club of Rome. Dr. King was visiting Australia and met with members of the Australian Club of Rome, with which I've been associated for 40 years. And we had a conversation, and I was then asked later on to be involved in the promotion of this book called The First Global Revolution, which was the report to the Club of Rome, and by the Club of Rome. So most reports tend to be written by authors in their own standing, such as the original Dr. Meadows' report with her and her colleagues. This one is actually a report by the Club of Rome. So it actually contains the official imprimatur of the Club of Rome. For me, the importance of the Club of Rome is to focus on what it called the problematique. In other words, the interconnectedness of issues. For example, if we make progress in saving people's lives, we then end up with a population problem. How do we then feed the population? Is the excessive use of fertilizers going to damage the environment? The Club of Rome, back in 1972, highlighted the interconnectedness of issues. This is now becoming more fashionable because of complexity theory, but the Club of Rome, right at the outset, was very innovative in this and was certainly very helpful to us back in 1972. I was then in Great Britain and part of the preparations for the British government's involvement in the United Nations Environment Conference in Stockholm, 1972. So this report, the earlier one, The Limits to Growth, played into those preparations. And this first global revolution has also helped to maintain momentum about it. Also, what is interesting in the report is a quotation from the late Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, the husband of Queen Elizabeth. He sent a message, the 20th anniversary conference of the Club of Rome, which was held in Paris. And the Duke said, the Club of Rome can take pride in the fact that it has been unpopular for the last 20 years. The tragedy is the Club of Rome has been giving us warnings that the international community has not paid enough attention to. So for me, one of the advantages of being associated with the Club of Rome is that I get an early warning on issues that need to be addressed, and I get ideas that I can then publicize in the Australian media. So I've very much enjoyed my association with the Club of Rome all these years. My final comment is, look after the planet and the planet will look after you.
Hello, everyone. I'm John Gilmore, speaking to you from Cape Town in South Africa. I'm speaking to you from the world's most unequal country. And I'm speaking to you in the context of the three books, The Limits to Growth, No Limits to Learning, and The Bounds of Possibility, created by Mamphela and the Black consciousness thinkers of the 1960s and 70s. Of course, the group of voyagers have been working together, negotiating the rapids of our thinking in search of new regenerative civilizations, and we are here to share those stories with you. As we've journeyed, we've recognized that we are transgressive thinkers and that we have been acting on the basis of believing that things can be regenerated. And it's the experience of our work at niche level that we are putting together as a collective so that we can create collective social learning. The current reality in Africa is that we have 105 million children not at school. We have a large number unskilled, unemployed, and of course women are at greatest risk. In 2050, 1 in 4 people on the globe will be African. Our hypothesis is that we need to shift education to be based on consciousness development. And the underpinning of this is that every child matters, and that every voice matters, and every story matters, and of course every life matters. Mamphela has shown us the way in terms of the Black consciousness movement, which gives us the legacy of paradigm shifting from the internalized oppression to the self-liberation, which leads us to regenerative maturity. We've been working in 6 different schools in areas of the lowest economic quintile to reverse the poverty cycle. The contexts are complex. Our vision is to transform these communities through meaningful education of children in those communities to become role models and change makers in the communities. We move our young people from the survival-based thinking, the uninformed position, through the reactivity, through to the exemplary global citizenship of generativity. To do this, we have to shift the assumptions through the pre-contemplation phase, through to the attitudes, and ultimately to a wellness lifestyle. This involves moving towards self-regulation, change-making, and optimizing mindsets around consumption. We've been doing this since 2004 with huge success, and the success is shown in the statistics, where 72% of our students are able to go to university, measured against only 5% of their peers in the communities in which we serve. We build around the community hub. We have 6 hubs reaching out into the community, and in each of those hubs is able then to leverage change within the community. We believe this is a model for Africa. We've developed the LEAP Institute, which takes the principles of consciousness shift, reaching out into community to shift mindsets, and the innovation of living learning to open career pathways for young people. The 6 levers we've identified through our work is that we need every child to have access to the digital highway through cell phones, to believe that every child can do maths, to enable every school to do laboratory work in the outdoors, and to transform leadership thinking to become transgressive and challenge the status quo. We do all of this work through consciousness raising, and we prepare our children for work readiness. As we look at this model shows us that in the narrow specific focus of teaching people the composting possibilities for heritage gardens involves storytelling, unlocking the questions, sharing the concerns, using Indigenous knowledge and practice to create shared purpose and action. This enables us to increase our handprint and decrease the footprint. By embracing the heritage in history and uncovering that heritage knowledge, we can incorporate it with science and develop a modern science integration which allows for these stories to actually become action. We do this in the form of vertical hanging gardens, as you can see here in one of our communities, and linking back to the heritage of the language and the activity of fermented grain and leafy greens and so on. We have to look at the living heritage to deal with climate change. We believe that we need to develop intrinsically motivated young people with raised consciousness, and they must understand the choices because they have choices. We must fulfill our mission, not allow ourselves again to betray it. Thank you for hearing, and thank you for the Voyagers group who've taken us through to this point. Thank you.
Is the end of our formal statements. Carlos Alvarez Pereira.
He had to go.
Oh, he's left us. I'm sorry about that. And I'm also very sorry that Wilhelm Kroll, formerly from the Volkswagen Foundation, who was with us prior to the time we had IT problems, has left because he was Volkswagen Foundation who did the major funding of the first project by which Dennis and Donella were able to do their project with all those people. Jay, would you like to say a word to us?
I'd be delighted.
Come and sit here.
I'll sit right next to you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Jay was part of the Donella Meadows Sustainability Institute, which, well, he'll tell us about.
Yeah, I served on Dana's board, and after Dana died, the board it morphed into the Donella Meadows Institute, and then into the Academy for Systems Change, which exists today. I feel that Limits to Growth laid the groundwork for a very important paradigm shift from the neoclassical model of economy, which created the problems that the Limits to Growth was addressing. That is putting primary emphasis on GDP growth at the expense of people and nature. Now, there's another model, an emerging model now, which I call a life-mimicking model, which is developing in the Nordic world, but has developed elsewhere. And it basically puts its primary emphasis on regenerating people and nature. And this model has the people in the Nordic world have attained the world's highest standard of living on normally balanced budgets, which is impossible for the United States, and also on declining ecological footprints. If we're capable of evolving, which is a possibility that Dennis held out, I believe that we have to move along that path. And the Nordics will be the first to admit that, you know, while they've helped to develop this model, they still have a lot to learn. I've written a book about it. It's called Economies That Mimic Life. It's been reviewed by several Club of Rome members, including two who wrote the book The Nordic Secret. They feel that there's a lot of truth to this model, economies that mimic life, and it's one that has to be built upon. And so I'll leave it at that. There's a reason for hope there. And and by the way, the leaders of all 5 Nordic countries are women.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you very much.
Happy to be here.
I wonder if Michaela Walsh is still among, because we can't see the people who are with us.
They've never on our list.
Yes. All right.
Excuse me, what is the name of the animal? Your name?
Jay.
Oh, Jay Bragdon.
Mamphela, would you like to make a remark about either Dana Meadows or? All right. All right. So do we have hands of people who must say something? Because we've heard quite a few. John Gilmore, did you want to give us a brief comment on limits to growth?
No, I've just felt the honor and privilege of being in the company of people who've pioneered 50 years ago and given us the platform from which to say the things we're going to say as the Voyagers group later on. So just, if I could just express my gratitude sitting in Cape Town in South Africa for the vision of those people who've spoken and shared so freely today. Thank you.
Good. So we have 2 choices now. Marilyn strongly feels that if we break for coffee, which everyone in this room would like to do, then we will, our virtual audience will have some problem with that. And we're very happy to go straight forward with Voyagers. But perhaps we could, 1 by 1 or 2 by 2, go get our coffee cookies from the back of the room and use the various facilities, and then we could begin the Voyagers part, because this then pivots from the past and honoring and celebrating a most unusual event happening here in the Boston area, with a young group of people guided by an older, wiser Jay Forrester and the Meadows and all the people that he showed, to what's happening now and going forward. And I think David Corton at the Cape Town meeting challenged us by saying that we can't eat money. And that means that we should think about another goal rather than financial, which would be much more contenting to the human species. And we have taken that as a very important pathway to follow. So this is an alternative to the World War II growth that we've just talked about, but built on thousands of years of pyramidal governance and monetarization as the citizens' best values. But it's looking back to the value of well-being and how can we pivot as a catalyst, and how can we share profoundly the deep and successful new pathways that so many of us have taken with much of our lives, and hundreds of thousands of people have followed for a better well-being. So there are 15 people who meet on a regular basis, and they're involved with the Earth's peoples and bettering them, and the Earth itself and the soil. And there are hundreds of thousands involved in each of these movements, and they're all moving down a pathway that's still foggy. So I'm going to let you listen to 6 of these voyageurs, and we call them voyageurs because that's a symbol that's important to us in the Western Hemisphere. These were very brave men, along with the indigenous people who went into the unknown parts of the cold north and brought back assets which were important to the civilized part of the world, which was, of course, at that time, Europe. So I would invite John Gilmore to share the screen with Ryan and let us know about your voyage. Changes in Catalyst.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I speak to you from the world's most unequal country. And the work I'm talking about takes into account the 50-year legacy of limits to growth. Also embraces the work of no limits to learning and the need to bridge the human gap, and further embraces and reflects the work of Bounds of Possibility, written by Mamphela, Ramphele, and others, to define and outline the legacy of Steve Biko and the Black consciousness movement in South Africa and Africa. I've been privileged to be part of a group of the Club of Rome Voyageurs, and we have been in search together across the rapids of our own thinking to seek new regenerative civilizations. We recognize, as we have been speaking together, that what we have in common is that we are transgressive and transformative in our attitudes and our thinking. And we believe that that is going to be critical in the transition towards a well-being economy for the globe. We know that regenerativity needs to replace the notion of sustainability. We understand that change starts in small places. Big ideas start at niche level. And so we share our ideas of what's happened in our lives at niche level in such a way that we can collect and develop a collective social learning. The current reality that in South Africa we are facing, and in Africa we are facing, is that more than 105 million of our children are not at school. And there's so many more being affected in the last couple of years, with more dropping out of school, with young women particularly vulnerable. And we have the opportunity or the threat of 2 billion African people in 2050, which means 1 in 4 people on the globe will be African. We believe that the shift that will bring the transformation and make this the African century is a shift of consciousness, and that we need to put the consciousness at the center of our education system, which basically, when addressed to a child, says, you're important, you matter, your feelings matter, your voice matters, and your story matters, and your life will always matter. We have a legacy on which to build. You see here a picture of a young Mamphela standing, speaking truth to power, who's designed with others a legacy of paradigm shift. And the paradigm shift that she modeled for us at that point was the shift from internalized oppression to self-liberation. And this we've integrated into the work of the Leap Science and Math School, where we take young people from the unconscious taking immaturity to the regenerative maturity of fully conscious citizens. We do this in 6 parts of South Africa, 6 different marginalized regions, economically marginalized, where we're dealing with the lowest economic quintile, and we're working to reverse the assumptions and the attitudes around poverty. This is the context in which we work. It's overcrowded, it has social problems, it has economic challenges. And our vision is to transform these communities through the meaningful education of children living in those communities, so that those children can be change makers in those communities. To do this, we understand we have to move people from the survival-based passivity to a generativity, to a creativity and a collaborative solution thinking mindset, which means moving from the uninformed, not knowing what you don't know, through to the compliance, but ultimately to the exemplary global citizenship. This is a difficult paradigm shift process, but again, modeled for us in so many different ways by the Black consciousness movement, alerting people to what they don't know, taking them to the contemplation phase, in preparing them for action, and then allowing that action to lead us towards lifestyle self-efficacy, the wellness that we all pursue. This involves paradigm shifts at many levels, shifting from survival to self-regulation, from fear to insight, from limits to growth warnings to change-making opportunities, from consumption obsessions to optimizing mindsets around how to consume. We've done this since 2004. Our indicators are clear. This is done and possible. Our 72% of our students can go to university measured against only 5% of their equivalents in the communities that we serve. It is possible, and it can happen dramatically. We've established 6 hubs, and we believe that the school hub serving the communities provides a model for an African hub network and for the change to sweep through Africa. To do this, we've established the LEAP Institute. And in that institute, we amplify the consciousness shift thinking. We work to outreach into communities to shift assumptions and behavior. We look for the innovation of learning through Ubuntu Maths and living learning laboratories, and we open career pathways for our children. We have 6 levers which we've identified over the past 20 years that are self-liberating levers. We need to have a cell phone in every African child's hand to shift the digital mindset. We need to believe that every child can do maths because they can. We need to know that every school does have a laboratory, but it's an outdoor living learning laboratory. We need to drive transgressive leadership. We need to raise consciousness so that metacognition and agency are liberated. And we need to take entrepreneurial mindset to another level. If you look at this graphic,
Well, I could just turn this off and you can ensure people.
sorry, what's happening? I can't hear.
Finish the slides because they can read the signs at least.
What is the problem? I can't hear you.
Well, and everyone else is hearing it, but not us.
I don't know what's happening.
No, we can't hear you, John. We in this room can't hear you. The other people on the virtual can't hear you.
Has that been for the whole presentation?
No, just the third to the last slide.
Okay, shall I continue?
Yes, please.
So here's a model of how change can happen. If you want to get people to use compost and to understand the value of it, take them back to their own stories. Go back to the Nguni gardens of the last century and the centuries before. Look for the patterns that exist. Develop a shared concern, shared purpose, and ultimately shared action. Activate the heritage learning. Claim the indigenous knowledge. Let's increase our handprints to decrease our footprints. Let's combine the head, the heart, and the hand, but look at history and claim the heritage, situate our learning and enhance our learning in the heritage. Reconcile the colonial exclusions by actually integrating indigenous heritage knowledge with modern science. If we look at how that can work out in our hanging gardens in one of our communities, we work with living heritage and climate change learning, with the heritage gardens capturing the history of the language, the history of the growing patterns, integrating that into the learning, and the inspiration to grow and to regenerate is intrinsically driven as opposed to extrinsically driven by fear. If you take the sustainable food issue, we can go to the fermented grain, the cultured milk, and the leafy greens of Africa and find the cultural connections. They're not difficult, they're right there. So we believe that we need to move young people to an intrinsic motivation. And you do that through raising consciousness, raising the metacognition, so that children understand the choices they have are real. Each generation, said Frantz Fanon, must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. And we, the Voyagers, and those of us in Africa, intend to fulfill it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. And our next Voyager, who deals not with South African children, but with Afghan children, and has had an equally strange ride down the rapids, adjusting, is Marilyn Mosely-Gordanier, a member of the USACOR board, a member of CORE, and she is the founding director of Laurel Springs Distance Learning Schools. So Marilyn, could you please tell us your voyage? Is your sound on? Your sound is muted.
Marilyn, you're muted.
Marilyn, you're muted.
Yes. First of all, I want to thank you, Anitra. Thank you, Mamphela, for this amazing day. And I want to say thank you, John. In the middle of my experience, you have been one of the guiding lights in in a situation that I never knew I would be able to manage and handle. And as I apply it now to Afghanistan, it's even more incredible. And so I've been sharing with our members the ongoing journey that we've had, and I think I can now incorporate some of the various principles that we've been working on together with our Voyagers, because this has been my voyage. I started working with distance learning with children in the United States, working on personalized learning and being the first online school, but I never believed that I would now be translating this to Afghanistan in a world where girls now are prohibited to going to school. So this has been a journey that I chose to take, and appreciate the support. I have to say the support I've had from the various members of CORE, which I'll share more. Just to give you some background, we started a program in 2013 for children, for girls to be educated. At that point, we were looking at girls who were not being instructed, who were home, who had no way of going to school and often had no shelter. This program was the promise to preventing girls from being married. And we had over 304 girls, of which only one was married by force. And just this year, 2 were married during the Taliban takeover. We've brought 304 girls through our program, and we currently have 9 in the university. And everything was working on the principle of support them to go to school, to help find their future. We had not really begun yet our Voyagers journey of what was to take place. And what was the impetus was the Taliban invasion that took place this year. It was not a surprise, but it happened quicker than we expected. And within weeks of the invasion on August 15th, our directors and our students were being threatened with bombs and threats of death for being involved with a US nonprofit educating girls. And so we learned very quickly how to evacuate people from Afghanistan after the airport was closed, after we were told it was impossible to get them out of Afghanistan. So I remember talking to Mamphela during this period, and I was crying, and she wrote me and she said, it's all about self-liberation. They have to liberate themselves. And I remember thinking, self-liberation, okay, what does she mean? How are we going to self-liberate them when they can't get out? And I kept thinking, okay, Mamphela did this in Africa. There's a model for this. We're going to find our way. We're going to find our way through this process. And somehow they held on to that. And so we commenced, though, with multiple attempts at evacuation through the State Department, through the Congress. None of them could get our people out. And then I found a young lady who lived an hour from here, who had a small group called Warriors Angels Rescue. And she evacuated our team overland through 17 Taliban checkpoints. And we moved 158 women, children, and men in one night to Pakistan. And at this point, I do want to say appreciation goes to Anitra Thorhaug, who was like a warrior on my side. Edward Manning, who helped to find a safe haven for them if they could move to Ecuador. John Gilmore, who has sat on calls with me and other members as we cried and worked ourselves through our process. Mamphela, who has been the model for us, and Ryan, who actually came to meet with us, and we did trauma training, and to all the other core members who sent notes of appreciation. So we did get our people out, those we could. Once we had them in Pakistan, where most of them reside right now until they move to their final destination, education became our most important focus. We could see that because of the trauma they've been through and because of the life they'd had, it was now time to start an education. And with that, I began to go back to the model of Laurel Springs, which is a personalized education, the model of LEAP schools, and also looking at how to heal the trauma these children had been through. We started the Vita School with children in Pakistan, Turkey, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and India. And our goal at the beginning was just to provide them with security and to help them begin to feel supported and empowered. And we began emotional healing from the very beginning. We had meetings with parents, children, and they were able to write, share, and tell their stories. So what we needed to do was also make sure that we continued their academics. It was very important to these parents and to us. They continued to have their schooling and the healing at the same time. Our first teachers, when you're doing a school and your every day is a different experience and a different learning process, were our evacuees. We had teachers who had been ministers in Afghanistan, doctors, oncologists, highest levels of math professors, and these were educating our children while they were in the middle of their evacuation. And so that was our beginning, and that happened all between October and November. So we were moving very quickly and quickly learning how to care for and create a program and an environment for these children. So as that was happening in Pakistan, I want to take you back to Afghanistan. While we were working in Pakistan, we continued with those girls who were not able to be evacuated or whose parents chose not to leave or for whom we did not have a passport. And so we had moved our director, we had a new team of young people. And I always think of LEAP when I think of we were empowering this young people. They took over and they began to deliver the food, the clothing, the education to our families. And they've been incredible. They are just the most beautiful and so inspired young people. And so with their help, we have continued the program. We have not missed 1 month of meeting with our families in the midst of a very, very dangerous situation. But then we had another change to our whole thinking. At this point, we were thinking support and a small school for those evacuees who had left. But then on March 23rd, when school opened and our girls were so excited to be going back to school in Afghanistan, when they arrived at school, they were told that 7th through 12th grade was closed indefinitely. And that was a huge heartbreak for them. I wish I could show you some of the videos I have. I have some amazing videos the girls sent us of their experience of despair at that moment and desperation. So suddenly we had 36 distressed girls. And what did we do? Well, we called John Gilmore, and he introduced us to the leadership transformation spiral. And I was thinking, and I began to think, how do we take this spiral? How do we take leadership? How do we discuss empowerment with girls who are being denied an education at a point when literacy was so low in Afghanistan? And so our team worked together. We looked at various models of empowerment, various options for teaching, for training, for sharing with girls who are now home, unable to leave their home. And during that period, we expanded our focus. I found through various, through searching, the former director of the Meadows International School in Afghanistan, one of the most beautiful, most realized women I have ever met. She had been evacuated. I searched high and low and I found her at the Wisconsin military base. I asked her to join me in creating a school for our girls. She soon invited all her teachers who were still back in Afghanistan to join us because they had been trained, the only school in Afghanistan, on the whole child using what is called the Waldorf method of education. And so together, we started developing coursework from March 23rd on, based on emotional healing academics and a very personalized approach, because each child is so different. Each child in Afghanistan has such a different experience, and each parent has been different. So all of a sudden, we had a director who spoke Dari, who could communicate with all our students, and we had teachers who had no job but needed work and were trained in holistic education. I considered this a miracle beyond my imagination, that we were beginning to put together a program for girls who had now been denied an education indefinitely. So suddenly we began to share our program with our girls. We met with parents. We began talking about what it meant to us, and the importance of education, the importance of being empowered as women. These girls are very, very, very invested in their own empowerment in ways that I had never known. And other girls began to contact us. Within 2 weeks, we had over 200 messages from girls all over Afghanistan. The word had spread that they wanted to get an education, that they were ready to go back to school with us, and that they were determined. And so quickly, we had to be simple, flexible, and quickly adjust to this need. And we did. We are still in the process of adjusting. We've created an entire curriculum using the Afghan national curriculum, which needed a lot more work in terms of critical thinking, project-based learning, focus on global citizenship and empowerment. Those are not components of the curriculum, but they are now components of the work we're doing. And with that, we started a new era of Vita School and a new era of Educate Girls Now. So now we're working with our families in Pakistan and all over that area, as well as girls in Afghanistan. And we found that by acknowledging their unique talents and experiences, we had a springboard for the future for them. We were contacted by the Afghan girls robotics team. Those girls had come to MIT and presented there. Some of them had been evacuated, others had not. And they joined our group and they became part of this new exciting program. And with that, we began to look at how do we help girls in the middle of a war zone? How do we help them, as Mamphela said, to liberate themselves, which kept coming up for me over and over, is how do you create liberation? And what I realized is you create opportunity. And with that umbrella of opportunity comes emotional and social awareness, the chance to talk and reflect, critical thinking, and then also helping them to see that the world is bigger than Afghanistan and they are global citizens. And so our teachers are amazing. The principal is beyond comprehension. And we've been building an awareness and being able to put our toe into thinking about what is consciousness? What does it mean to be a conscious human being, no matter where you are, no matter if you're in a war zone, no matter if you're being told you have to wear a burqa. And by the way, our girls have been told they have to wear burqas, which is total covering. The process has been slow. In terms of communication, what we discovered that the very first thing to do was to start with a safe conversation, acknowledging each girl's experiences and talking about being one family with the world. We've started our teacher training. And John, I just want to say that I'm looking forward to the chance for our director to be part of the Ubuntu movement. I think that she is a shining example and needs to know there are others who are doing the work, and to train her and to have her be part of it with her incredible valor would be amazing, because she's been leading the focus on heart-based learning, listening to our students, teaching the teachers how to teach when families are resistant to change, and working with our girls on expressing their feelings. And again, Ryan came and met with us as well and worked on a trauma therapy. For those of us who've been doing the work, we had to work with our own trauma and come to a point of acceptance and move through that. So creating well-being, how does that apply? Well, this has been the journey. When I first began working with the well-being group, I really had to look at it, not from a point of what are we doing, but what are we creating? Where are we going? And I think I'm on a path to understanding. And I remember one time John said to me, okay, now let's get, in a sense, out of the weeds and look from the big picture. And each day I feel like I'm getting better and better at getting past the emotion to a big picture and expanding and changing. And so we're remaining open and responsive. And every day there's a new change. This week we spoke to the Asian University for Women in Bangladesh, and they have offered our girls 14 through 18 the opportunity to go there for their education in high school, and then they will be accepted for their bachelor's and master's degree. So my journey for well-being is including the process of self-exploration to finding, as John said, those levers that really make the difference. And as we are in the middle of, we're probably still past the storming phase into the forming phase. We're still in the forming phase because every day we have new girls joining us, and every day we're working to orient them and bring them into the program. But I want to say that it's been one of the most incredible journeys that I've ever taken in my life. And I wanted to share with you a beautiful message from one of our girls who actually graduated from us, went on to the Asian University for Women, and now is in Brandeis. And I love her. She, to me, is an example. And I just want to read what she wrote to me. I call my new vision the core of humanity. When I was in Afghanistan, I used to repeat several times a day, I am proud of being a Muslim, and I was born a Muslim. It was a statement my parents taught me to repeat since I was a little child, but I did not realize that I might be putting down other religions and other faiths. I thought about the core of humanity and decided to practice humanity by being truthful with myself and others, accepting others with their different faiths, being open to learning from others, and giving others a smile. And that, to me, is the beginning of self-liberation and consciousness. And so I thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this. And again, thank you to the many people at core who have helped. And if anyone wants to reach me, they're welcome to. But again, much appreciation.
Our next speaker goes from educating the very poorest to the poor and women who have no opportunity to creating well-being in small communities. And Ted Manning from the Canadian Club of Rome has worked in 50 countries around the world and is an expert in finding community accord and better community pivoting from a community not in well-being to a community which has good goals and is working with community veterans. Go ahead, Ted.
Julia. No,
No, not you.
you're very much. I'm happy to talk to you. I don't know if I should just hit this when my slide goes on. Oh, sorry. Yeah. I'm going to try and tell you that there are no limits if we choose that to be the case. We're going to look from the notion of beginning, we're identifying limits and what we can't do, and what we shouldn't do, but to try and figure out how we can figure out what we really should do. And we are always part of an ecosystem, whether we pretend we aren't. And that is really where the whole issue starts. Because if we are going to start our whole lives and our activities on a premise that's wrong, we got to change. We can't really change the system. We got to change ourselves. We've been very fortunate to pull together more than a dozen people by the top of Rome who are interested in not just seeing where the limits are, but how we can in fact move the dialogue. And not just looking at limits, and for gosh sakes, not talking about dollars. We're going to look at what the real perception of what value is, and to get away from the simple metrics that obsess some people, like GDP or their waste size, all the things on which they focus everything, and they generally ignore everything else that's important. And most of the metrics we use are totally insufficient. There's a picture there of a lovely river in the Amazon. How many dollars is that worth? And why would you even try? The fact is that there are many values intrinsic to a lot of the things that we have to really deal with. Limits to growth definitely triggered people to consider these kinds of relationships. Biggest problem was up till about that point, more was considered the only reason to exist. But for decades, other than the economists, other disciplines like philosophy, sociology, environmental science, geography, like me, have sought ways to broaden the discussion to other critical values. It's not what it's worth, at least in money, it's what it's worth to humanity, to society, and to our sustained life on this planet. Over the years, I've worked for close to 50 years as a geographer in almost every country in the world. And we began, a reason I got into it was reading books, and one of them was Limits to Growth. And I thought, gee, that's a lot more interesting than what most of the other people are talking about. There really are limits, and we've discovered that. We have discovered human activity like these mobs on the beach in Romania, where we ran some joint projects with Mamphela and trying to restore the Black Sea. We often don't understand that until it gets so bad that we step in it. We don't recognize these relationships. We often don't even value the ecology that we live in, even when we identify them as resources critical to our survival. We still don't pay any attention to it. The efforts to regress are often very, very fragmented. The idea of being, oh, we'll make more of something. We'll use a little less, but the notion of actually trying to understand the human biosphere relationships escapes us. Thank God we're getting to the point, or thank whatever deity on which you wish to depend, that we are starting to realize that we have to understand those relationships. So how does the idea of well-being then come in? And that's what we're using as the metric, in a sense, a very vague and very complex metric regarding what we are really trying to do. The idea is that usually human use of the planet were not even considered. The idea that people could take all they want and there'd be more and don't worry about it. Many of the core scholars and many of the others are clearly understanding that we have to go beyond the idea of limits and try and identify opportunities to look at what are the real values. And I'll spend just a minute or two to tell you how we've been doing that. We started a project several years ago with several UN agencies to try and escape the idea that David Gorton had said you can't make money, and to get people to talk about something other than value in monetary terms. to share ideas and solutions. And we began it via Brundtland and the World Conservation Strategy, and based many of them on the idea that we had to understand quantities and the stresses. And the key for our work has been participatory goal definition and participatory workshops in over 50 countries around the world, and other applications in nearly 100. Most governments are now using this, and the reason we are there is because I and a few other colleagues started at the beginning, where we realized that the resources that are critical to the planet are in fact in peril, and we better damn well do something about it. So the big problem is, can you start local or go global? We have found through case studies around the world that there are many success stories. And the thing is, the local community usually understands those relationships. The term we say is you can see from your front porch when you destroy something. It's not abstract. It's not a way. It's not something that really is foreign. It's in your own backyard. And in a small community, and we work a lot with small islands, you wreck the island, you've got nowhere to go. There's nothing left. And you can see the damage as it happens, and you can see it washing in across your beach. We have a number of success stories now internationally. I talk to anybody who's interested about them. But the whole idea is that we can focus on the stressors, and we are identifying a number of success stories globally. We've been running workshops all over the place to try and make a difference, to get people to define what's important to them, to look at the changes that are affecting them, to communicate with each other, and the big problem to communicate up. We've been working with many UN agencies just to do that. Now, why is this relevant to limits? Well, that's where it all started, at least for me and most of my colleagues. We were intrigued by the idea that you could actually manage the stresses that humans have on places. What we are really struggling with is how we do it globally. We can do it one community at a time. We can do it one island at a time. We can do it in one case study at a time. All of these are case studies that we did, and to produce that big manual in the upper right-hand corner. Hundreds of community level workshops that really are yielding successful human biosphere relationships, restoration, and balanced and long-lasting, survivable and sustainable communities. To end, we now have established a series of sustainable tourism workshops using the tourism sector and UNESCO and World Heritage Sites to get people to actually put in action sustainability strategies at a very local level. The biggest one is Tenerife. The smallest one is about the size of this room. But the fact is that these are pathways to well-being, one community at a time, one sector at a time. Doing it globally is very perplexing, and that is still a challenge, and something that I think the Club of Rome can be very, very helpful in trying to do that. So well-being is really the goal. The limits of reaching the goal are in your mind. If you're obsessed with a particular metric, you may well solve for that at the expense of all else. We have a nice little project going in Guyana just to try and identify the stresses on that particular environment. So the whole problem we have is one of moving the whole human dialogue from quantity more to quality, to retaining those attributes of the planet that allow it and us to survive effectively. So are limits to growth important? They sure were at the start, and they're becoming even more so if we don't pay any attention.
Thank you, Ted. We have several other people working at the community level. One is Robert Girardet, and he is working on ex-urban and agricultural communities. And another is David Pollock from Canada, who has worked on both community, large-scale urban communities as well as regions. We're going to go to our esteemed member, Julia Kim, who has worked with the country of Bhutan, one of the few that has well-being as a national goal. So this is the here, the apex of what could happen if the whole world pivots. This is a stellar example. So, Ryan, if you would put Julia.
My name is Dr. Julia Kim, and I am the program director of the Gross National Happiness Center in Bhutan. And I've had the privilege of moving back and forth over the last 10 or 20 years between the so-called developed countries and the so-called developing countries. And the bridge between that was a period in New York when I was working with the United Nations. And it raised a lot of questions to me about what we measure in terms of progress and what do we mean when we talk about development. And I think coming across the work of Donella Meadows and others associated with the Club of Rome really planted some important seeds for me to take my personal questioning about this much further to a systems level. And in Bhutan, I think as many people are aware, the country has been measuring progress not through GDP primarily, but through gross national happiness, which really takes the idea of a well-being economy seriously in the sense that you can measure indicators through national surveys, connect them to policymakers, and kind of steer the country towards one that supports happiness and well-being, not just of humans, but of all life. And so it's no coincidence that Bhutan has been recognized as not only a carbon neutral country, but a carbon negative country, and that they've committed to keep at least 60% of the country under forest cover for all time, so not time limited. And you might ask yourself, how is this possible? And is it only possible in an exotic Himalayan country, or are there possible lessons for all of us here? And I'm more and more convinced that there are lessons here for all of us. And Bhutan doesn't claim to have all the answers. It's not a perfect country, but they are moving in that direction, and leadership has played a really important role. And I think that's one of the lessons here, not just leaderships of the hierarchical political kind, although that helps, but the leadership of ordinary people, the inner leadership, our commitment to the values that underlie a well-being economy. And I think I always quote the first Prime Minister of Bhutan, who defined happiness in the following way. He said, "True abiding happiness cannot exist while others suffer, but comes from serving others, living in harmony with nature, and coming to know our true and brilliant own wisdom of our own minds." So that right away talks about how our own inner development, our cultural development, our relationship with others, our compassion, and our connection to nature are very much a part of creating a culture of well-being. So that's one aspect, the inner and leadership development aspects. Another is the systems change, the measurements, really measuring what matters, as I mentioned earlier. And I think the third is really looking at what the best of science tells us makes human beings happy. And there's a beautiful quote from Donella Meadows. I'll paraphrase it here. Some of you may be familiar with it, but she basically says it's not big fancy cars or endless shopping for new clothes that makes us feel fulfilled and happy, and that trying to chase after real needs through material needs will never lead to that kind of satisfaction. And some people will say, well, that might be something that only you in developed wealthy countries can talk about. And it's true that I think in countries that are still trying to meet basic needs, they have to really reach a certain amount of economic development and stability. And sufficiency is a word that really, I think, speaks to me. Sufficiency in meeting material needs, but also sufficiency in looking at how much do we really need in the developed countries. And so that's where I think coming back to North America, as I have over the COVID pandemic time, has really opened my eyes to what really makes us happy. Strong communities, good relationships, not endless consumerism. And it's very interesting that the Easterland paradox has shown that above meeting a certain level of GDP, more and more GDP growth does not actually contribute to more well-being in developed countries. So meeting basic needs, but then looking at what else should be measuring and really promoting in our societies. And here it is, the things that we're all aware of, maybe through COVID, our time use, our work-life balance, whether we feel loved and secure in our relationships, whether our communities are supportive of each other or divisive and moving against each other, whether we have a sense of trust in our governments, whether we feel a sense of agency and meaning in our lives. And again, these aren't kind of vague, unmeasurable things. They can be measured. They can be brought into policymaking, as we have done in Bhutan. And I think they can be a North Star for our future. So I think it's an exciting time. I think we've learned a lot from looking at the past and the post-World War economic boom. We've seen the limitations of that. And now it's really taking stock of what matters and adjusting where our ship is going. And we're really looking at equity, well-being for a healthy planet. So those are the remarks that I wanted to share. And I'm really honored to be a part of this gathering and to bring my voice in. Thank you very much.
I've been in many countries. I spent most of my career living abroad and working with people in dire poverty. I lived in Haiti for a year, dealing with people after their devastating earthquake in 2010. I spent time in Brazil, in Belize, Mexico, and many other countries. And I've seen terrible suffering throughout. And many of the speakers today have spoken about well-being. What is that? Is that based on a European or North American value system? Does that mean that we have a comfortable lifestyle with a large house and large car and all of the comforts that many people have become used to? Or is there something deeper than that? So one of my dear friends in Central America was a Salvadoran refugee who fled El Salvador to Belize. And he was earning $5 a day, working 16-hour days, 6 to 7 days per week. And his family had never had electricity or running water. They never had a roof that wasn't just patches of boards. They never had a floor that was anything other than dirt. But they had joy. They were one of the happiest families I'd ever met. Until tragedy struck and they lost their mother. So what is well-being and where does that come from? We can't expect it to come from the outside because we're living in a world that is turning into hell. We're seeing children murdered. We're seeing wars in so many different places. We're seeing poverty. And the most devastating thing of all is hopelessness. When people lose hope, then they lose their peace. They lose their well-being. They lose their ability to feel joy. When people have no hope that anything will ever be better, sometimes they turn into the monsters that we often see in the news, willing to kill in order to simply be remembered. We see countries so desperate to restore their old identity as an empire that they're willing to invade their neighbors and take tens of thousands or more of innocent lives simply to get that status and be remembered. We need to find a way to restore hope to these people, the victims of violence, the victims of poverty and greed. So we have to work on ourselves first. We need to be able to, as Viktor Frankl said, exercise our last and greatest freedom, that freedom to choose how we will react in any given situation. There are not going to be many better times than now. War is getting worse. The difference in income between the nations and the individuals is getting worse. Access to food in many countries is getting scarcer and scarcer. We can choose to be greedy and hoard as much as possible so we can maintain the lifestyles we have. Or we can try to bring as many people up to a sustainable lifestyle as possible. Feed the hungry, take care of the sick. Try to spread peace rather than conquest. Let's try to be remembered for doing some good in the world rather than just wanting to be remembered, even if it's for bloody murder. There's so much good still left. Each day there are people that are doing wonderful things. Many of the people who spoke today have done so much good in the world. When I met with Marilyn and the women working with her to help the Afghan refugees, I was so proud of them for the work that they've done to help those poor women. And yet they were still so hurt because they couldn't do more. They couldn't help all of them. And I wanted them to know that the little bit that they've done to help hundreds of women has made a mark on so many more. They have touched their lives. They have shown the women of Afghanistan and their daughters that women can make a difference in the world, and that they are not property. They are not to be treated as property. So imagine each of those girls, how many lives they will touch. We can spread the seeds of good, or we can settle for the misery that's in the world and complain about the situation and make it worse. So I invite you to do more. Be a little bit kinder. Be a little bit better. Don't let the fear and the hopelessness define your lives. Find that inner strength to make a difference in this world.
Thank you. Now, as very anticlimactic to the speakers we've heard, and certainly anticlimactic to our chief speaker, Dr. Ramphele, I'm going to talk about regeneration of key ecosystems in the world, because that's how I've spent a good portion of my life. As a young woman, I decided to pivot from defining more and more all the horrible things that were going, polluting, killing things. And as I did that, I found a new breadth of life that I'd like to share with you, because now I'm prepared to go all the way up. So what do I push? There we go. So what are the benefits if we renewed all of the ecosystems in the world? Limits to Growth doesn't focus on the renewable. It focuses in 41 quotes on the non-renewable. It has one quote about the renewable. So, of course, the benefits are more oxygen to breathe, the fundamental quality of that, more water, fresh water to drink, more diversity of plants and animals, especially fish in the ocean, and a wonderful cure for climate change, which is sequestration of carbon by the coastal and many of the other. So that's what the benefits are. Now, we have been looking and trying to think about degeneration, all the pollution and the pollution laws and everything that Sandrine said happened in the 70s. And then our common future, the Brundtland report, which was a woman's report, Mrs. Brundtland, the Prime Minister of Norway, talked about sustainability as some kind of negotiating point with the industries that were present. But what we really need to get to is the regeneration of development. And I'm going to tell you why. And I'm going to tell you how much better off and well we would be if we had regeneration. First of all, what was my pathway? And why were hundreds of thousands of people, in fact, millions coming along? And I did an intervention underwater, and this was useful to planners, regulators, and we made that process not only national, but regional and global, and found out how much was damaged and what we could do to recolonize. And now we're at the point of how much will it cost, what will the benefits be worth, and who does it, which of course is the citizens of each small community and much of the unemployed and many of the concerned people. So there I was in a nuclear power plant hearing many years ago, and the judge said, "Young lady, you've said why it's polluting, but can you store?" And I said, "I don't know, Your Honor. Nobody ever has. Nobody's done that underwater, but I could try." So then that's me, of course, underwater many years ago. And I tried, and it worked. And the next point was I wasn't happy with just that, so I went up and down the bay, Biscayne Bay, Florida, 38 miles long and 11 miles wide, and I put it in test plots and found that the part of the bay that was 75% dredged or filled or completely contaminated had a lot of potential. So I pulled together a very large group, and I made it a futures group, past, present, and future. We published a book. This is all in 1977. And we found that the governance and the decision makers and stakeholders all agreed on one thing. We didn't want to live with this degraded asset. We wanted to regenerate it. So there we were. But what was interesting was that everybody else liked what we did. They were jealous, and so they copied it nationwide. And so it generated itself mirror images up and down the East Coast, the Gulf of Mexico, and finally the West Coast of the United States. We created an NGO called Restore America's Estuaries, which have about 2,500 people now. And there's a national estuary program of the US government, but many other nations followed. And we first went to this nation here, Jamaica.
Anitra,
See your slides.
we can't see the slides. They're not transitioning. We're still on the first slide.
No, we're still on the first one.
Sorry.
We're not seeing the slides.
Apparently it's showing only the main screen that we're seeing it advancing.
Oh, we can see it. Thank you.
Thank you. You can see it now? Yeah. They can see it.
We can see it now.
You can see it now. Okay, so this is Jamaica, and we scaled what I did in the one bay, which was copied up and down the United States coast.
Okay.
Country of Jamaica underneath here. And the government chose 19 types of put a bunch of different seagrasses in each of these.
Well, that's Anitra,
groups of
the American member. You've met her, I think. And,
how many?
well, she is somewhere in there, the original writer.
Is somebody talking?
And actually the husband of the original writer, Meadows, will talk.
All right, so we found solutions to the various kinds of pollutions. And having done that, we had a series of workshops and stakeholder meetings with government and NGOs, academics, and funders, and took this all around both the Caribbean, which is 58 countries, and South America. So then I went to the Philippines, an amazing point of the Marcos regime. And all I had to do to get policies done there was go shoe shopping with Mrs. Marcos, quite literally. And she would sit there getting her feet measured in her own special shoe factory, and I would get mine, and the head of environment was a woman, and she would get hers, and the head of the Philippine Senate was a woman, so it was the sisterhood getting these environmental policies for mitigation of coastal resources done, but we got it done. The next thing is to show the benefits to the public and to benefactors and other people, and above all, climate change. This finishes the loop. This is where fossil fuels come from. They're fossil because they're old plants that went down into the sediment and got fossilized, and now they can pull them up. But oxygen in the air, we forget that when we kill the last plant, we will not have anything to breathe. And it increases fish, which 4 billion people in the world depend on coastal fish, and it increases biodiversity and habitats. This is a coral restoration. The next giant step was that we looked very carefully and calculating the degradation of all these major kinds of ecosystems. And seagrasses is being, which is what I really work on, 7% for mangroves at 6%, corals at 8%, fisheries extreme pollution, particularly in the Pacific, temperate forests, according to FAO, the forestry agency of the United Nations, has an 85% of the temperate forest loss. Tropical forests also 85%, and boreal forests are the fastest changing. Another member of the Club of Rome, Bob Costanza, and his team have shown the value of the ecosystems. And you see the tropical forest here in the Amazon and in the Cameroon and in southern the Cone of Africa, and the Southeast Asia ones are the most important. But the boreal forests, red indicating very valuable ecosystems. Whereas in the temperate zone, where all Western society has been industrialized, it's very, very poor. So here we are with many ladies in the Andes restoring trees. We remember my dear friend Wangari Maathai, who said, this calls for a shift in our thinking so humanity stops threatening its life support systems. We are called to assist the earth heal her wounds, and in the process we heal our own. We embrace the whole creation and its diversity, beauty, and wonder. Wangari won a Nobel Prize, I believe it is in 2006, for the work she did in Africa and Kenya and other places with women planting trees. And then, unfortunately, she passed away slightly afterwards. So here is my real generative idea for the day. And this is the cost of the degradation. And this is what has been degraded on each of these mangrove, coral, seagrass, temperate, and tropical ecosystems. And this is the cost in billions of dollars of what has been degraded. And this is the cost to restore. And it really is not that much, and it will turn out to be, of course, at least $50 billion. On the other hand, the Marshall Plan to restore Europe and all its infrastructure, and this is the infrastructure of our globe, cost more in today's dollars. And I have not yet come to the point of what the post-regenerative value is going to be, but it's going to be about 10 times, perhaps 20 times as much. And here's where the forests are left, and there's some in the Amazon, there's some in central Cameroon and down to South Africa, and here and in the boreal areas. So what do I have to say? First of all, We're at the outreach stage, so the population has to understand their own role in consuming the oxygen, consuming the water, taking spaces to live and farm away from the fundamental habitats. And here is a leaf school where they are all planting speckboom, which is a natural and native endemic plant, which sequesters large amounts of carbon, keeps the water in, and used to be the food of elephants and all kinds of other native wildlife, but was taken out by the early Dutch colonists in favor of agriculture and other kinds of human activities. Each person has to learn the responsibility for their footprint versus their handprint. Handprint is active doing things. Footprint is the space and the other resources that you take up. And we need citizen measurements. We need the children to go out and measure how this speckboom regenerates itself and the plants and the animals that come in and the water that accumulates under it. We need people of all generations to understand by measuring and giving us citizen measurements. We need a work plan from the governments. We need the global forest to be at least 600,000 kilometers, and that would regenerate enough gigatons to almost halt global warming. We need the mangrove people to regenerate about 45,000 kilometers. The coral reefs, the seagrass people. Here is a big nation that has pivoted from a polluting and taking nation to a restoring nation. And this is a mangrove offshore in Oman in the Indian Ocean. So we need action groups and individuals because it is time to act. It isn't time to sit around and measure the footprint of the elephant anymore. Outreach of values in the ecosystems, local projects of regeneration, finding donors, and important outreach products like films, articles, videos, scripts, podcasts, ballets, anything we can get our hands on. Government action. Governments don't have national plans for regeneration. Certainly on the coastline, almost none do. We have to organize large-scale demonstration projects so stakeholders and businesses see that this really works very well, and we have to measure it. So thanks for imagining with us, because this is a large reimagining the earth. But I want to tell you that our merry band of voyageurs, whoops, how do I get back to that? Oh, you took me off the slide. The merry band of voyageurs has been working forward very hard on listening to one another and attempting, yes, I was on third to the last. And here we are going into the mist to try to regenerate people and ecosystems and to regenerate things that can be regenerated and will make much better well-being for people. And what we're doing is looking at the poorest of the poor, John Gilmore and Marilyn, communities of well-being, TED, David Pollock, Herbert Girardet, regional actions such as Julie Kim, and recuperation from catastrophes such as Ryan and Tom Powers, and regeneration of the earth. We just want to say that we have to regenerate mindsets in ourselves, as Donella Meadows said, and in others. We want interconnectedness, aligning intent with our action, and getting our hands dirty. That's very important, to get dirty hands by touching all this and becoming one with it, and scaling it for people and ecosystems. So my final message and the voyageurs' message is get your hands dirty and get it done. Now I think this is the happiest moment in the whole program, because we are going to give the Donella Meadows Award to Mamphela And we're hoping to put it on her neck, except my fingernails. Maybe Bobby, fingernails are longer than mine to get this thing apart. Because the man who polished this beautiful silver medal from the silver mines of Guanajuato, Mexico, took the ribbon off the medal. And so I'm being very awkward here. But maybe, do you think you could help me? I have hands under the water so much I never have fingernails. It's my problem. You have you. My hands are always in the muck, in the muck. So this was designed by me, but there are so many similar qualities. You were both women with great vision. You both wanted equity of distribution. You wanted a better world. You wanted to be a catalyst, and each in your own way made a huge, huge impression on the 20th century and moving and working and maturing into the 21st century. We hope we will do as much then as you do now. And there you are. We aren't Harvard, but we're giving you the Donella Meadows on her. It's definitely Western Hemisphere, designed by me and from the silver mines in Guanajuato, Mexico.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. So I don't think you need an introduction to us. I think that you want me that say Mamphela is well known because of her magnificent work with the partner Castillo and the medical students in Transvaal. And
Whatever's talking.
because her work at the World Bank, and most of all because she is the leader, the first female leader of the International Club of Rome, which is a huge leap forward for women all over the world.
We can both stand up for a moment so we can get a nice picture. If you both.
And Bobby, Bobby is our secretary, and Ryan,
Yeah.
come in the middle. You're in the
Well, I'm gonna take one right now from with light. So I'm gonna go around this side, so you're gonna face the window.
Wait,
Around the
there's
seats,
the
and
window,
other
so-
see your faces. Buddy Dave, don't forget to smile. Okay. And with luck, this will all come out for us.
Well, it's been a long, beautiful day. And I can only say thank you, all of you, particularly to Anitra for being the energy and the motivator of the celebration of Donella Meadows' 50 years ago. It is sad that it has taken so long for the Club of Rome to celebrate her leadership in the work that led to the publication of the list. I'm particularly grateful to Anitra for her untiring attention. It is also fitting that we are celebrating Donella in Boston, because that's where she did her seminar. In singling out Donella Meadows' heroic leadership of the Limits to Growth reports, we cannot but be struck by her extraordinary insight and her willingness to subjugate her acknowledgement as the lead author to ensure that the male supremacist world of that time would not have an excuse for not reading or taking the report seriously. It takes very mature ego to do what she did. We also celebrate Donella Meadows for popularizing systems thinking in academic and in civic conversation. There is a beauty conjured up by the phrase she coined as the title of a book
she could not complete before her passing in February 2001, dancing with sisters. Just think. In it, she said, living successfully in a world of systems requires more than the ability to calculate. It requires full humanity, our rationality, our ability to sort out truth from falsehood, our intuition, our compassion, our vision, and our knowledge. Today, I would like to invite you to come with me as we imagine a Club of Rome in the year 2050, with the benefit of lessons learned from Donella, Meadows, and other systems thinkers. What would the Club of Rome then look like? What impact would it have made? What lessons would be reflected in how it engages with the existential issues facing our race and planetary system? What would people say of it in their conversations in academic circles, in learning communities, in political circles, amongst young people and their leaders? The Club of Rome's profile has risen tremendously over the last few years. This year, the Limits to Growth celebrations have significantly elevated our visibility. The webinars and publications that have been released, such as Limits and Beyond, edited by Ugo Badi and Carlos Pereira, and others that are still in the process, have made more people aware of our work and its importance in understanding how to tackle planetary emergencies. Significantly, people in most of the world who had been unaware of even the existence of the Club of Rome are taking a keen interest in our work. How are we to leverage this visibility to become more effective and have a higher impact on building a momentum to promote global equity for a healthy planet? An important starting point in imagining the Club of Rome 2050 would be for us to have clarity on what our unique value proposition is. We are a small entity of just over 100 people at the international level and a few more dozens in our national and regional chapters. This is far too little in a world of 8 billion people. It is clear that our heritage from systems thinkers, including Donella and Gregory Bateson and others, that what distinguishes us from other institutions is our striving to understand how living systems change. Learning entails observing, listening, and being willing to simultaneously engage with different viewpoints in a manner that promotes deeper conversations and wisdom that leads to high impact actions. As a small-sized entity, we would do well to hone our skills to be a more efficient catalyst of learning processes and not try to compete with others. We must seek to collaborate, and now the word is no longer competitive advantage, but collaborative advantage in working with others who share or could be persuaded to share our values of global equity for a healthy planet. An effective catalyst in human terms is an enabler whose talk, enthusiasm, and energy get others to be more friendly, more enthusiastic, more energetic, more mobilized for transformative action. We've got one of those here. But we also know from Donella Meadows that an essential element in collaborative work is our willingness to listen to one another and to seek the truth rather than to seek to be right. I always remind myself that our Creator gave us 2 of these and 1 of this. 2 years, 1 month. The Club of Rome's Emerging New Civilizations initiative that I played together with Carlos has been exploring how humanity might learn anew how to be. We even produced a report as NC with our time. An Australian Indigenous leader, the late Bob Randall, who was known as the keeper of the Uluru Rock, told Lynn Gorison, who's an author of a book called Building Innovations on Millions of Years of Nature's Intelligence. Bob told Lynn that finding our way home entails becoming indigenous again. Being indigenous again draws us to the essence of what it means to be human. Human beings are wired to be interconnected and interdependent in the web of life. We are forging partnerships with entities that share our values and are engaged on the ground across the globe. For example, the Ubuntu Learning Movement is led by Livich, we have just been enlightened about. We are also part of the UNESCO-led partnership called Bridges, focusing on transforming the higher education learning approach to elevate the humanities to their rightful place in scholarship. We are also co-leaders in the hashtag Learning Planet movement, which connects innovators in education and learning from around the globe. We ensure that our role in such partnerships and our convening power is leveraged to enhance our catalytic impact. It is vital to minimize the risk of trying to be everywhere and anytime. It's not possible to be everywhere and to do everything. The hashtag Learning Planet movement is in turn a catalyst of transformation of education and learning systems from the current industrial revolution model to a 21st century learning model. The vision is a world where humanity becomes more intentionally conscious of being interconnected and interdependent in the web of life. 21st century education and learning must graduate critical thinking, active citizens committed to lifelong learning within the web of life. Working towards the envisaged Club of Rome 2050 requires that we also pay attention to ensuring that we have a diversity of members from most of the world beyond the current Euro-American and male dominance. Building towards this diversity requires that each one of us pays attention to attracting people beyond our own networks. We need to cast our collective net wider. For example, when we visit geographies that are underrepresented in the Club of Rome, we should be on the lookout for possible candidates. We meet in conferences, in webinars, in civil society organizations, so that we can become a more effective catalyst which learns from a pluriversal set of perspectives from across the globe. My vision of the Club of Rome 2050 is that of a vibrant, catalytic entity led by young leaders, under 50s, with a diversity of members, including a predominance of people from Mosely and indigenous people whose knowledge of how living systems work and change is much higher than ours. Leveraging the richness of the combination of indigenous wisdom and modern science would enable us to be more effective as a voice in promoting global equity for a healthy planet. I thank you all.
That's extremely important. And I concur completely with your vision. We have had, for instance, Roberto Toom as a member, and I've never seen her at a meeting. And I think a small amount of help to a meeting and valuing it would be extremely interesting. And since poor Ruth Mamphela has left New York City, she hasn't been able, because she works with HIV victims in Cameroon and adjoining countries, she hasn't been able to get money to come to the meetings in Europe, but she is a very valuable person who's working there on the ground with a big catastrophe every moment. And so they're actually people who could be of value immediately who aren't drawn into the circle of discussion.
Thank you. I just want to make a special statement. I just want to say I'm really moved by this matter, because I didn't come here expecting to be awarded anything. I came to share, and I've really enjoyed hearing all of the wonderful work that you are doing here, and you are inspiring others to do. But this is really very special. And thank you, Anitra, for thinking about it. And thank you, Brian and Ted and all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here. We're very, very happy to have you. And Donella would have been very happy. And you were a good friend of Donella's. Would she not have been very happy?
Absolutely.
He was on her board for years, and we were a student with Donella.
Yeah.
And I think she would be sitting someplace in the furthest reaches, smiling right now. Yes, thank you. John Gilmore had some things to say about sustainability and regeneration. Would you like to talk to us now about those?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just to say congratulations to my African sister, the mother of Africa, South Africa, our inspiration. If ever this was a coming together and a point of convergence in the work that you do, this is it. And thank you. You continue to lead us and inspire us in so many different ways. And thank you, Anitra, for setting this whole thing up and driving it with the energy and the purpose and the commitment that you do it. You drive us all hard, but you do it with such intent that that we can't but be part of it. Okay. And the point I just wanted to make was that I think as a group of voyagers, we've really realized that the change begins with us, and that it is our mindset shift change, our paradigm change, that is pivotal to any idea of change at any other level. We've got to move beyond the idea that we're working for some kind of sustainability based on extrinsic pressures of fear or enticement. We've got to move to the intrinsic motivation, which comes through the consciousness raising and the invitation to be regenerative, to actually develop new things, find ways of growing in new ways, and not think we've got to sustain something that is threatened, and we will never achieve that. And I think that this conversation today takes us to a commitment that we need to make to break our own paradigms around the intellect being the gateway to learning, and embrace the idea that regenerative work requires unlearning, letting go, getting your hands in the muck. That's really what I wanted to say, Anitra.
Van Hudson, who's part of the Voyagers, and who comes at this from a viewpoint of a nuclear physicist who has taken the 12-step program and is now a Buddhist. Could you talk to us about how the Voyagers are coming along? Because he's been every step of the way paddling his part of the canoe.
Van, you're muted.
Van, you're muted.
I was asking how was my audio. Now can you hear? Well, I'm reminded that the people's seems like we all have this tendency toward thinking we're independent, we're permanent, and we're unchanging. And those things are all wrong. And we've had a lot of the interdependence is the core of systems thinking. And I've always been amazed that by today's standards, the computing capabilities that the MIT team used were very primitive. Yet it's the overall overvision of Jay Forrester, even if it wasn't on a napkin, but being able to look at the elements of our material world, how they react together, and how each one affects another one, was able to, that led to these graphs of rising and peaking and decaying, that really tells the message in a form that a lot of people can understand. There's an observation's been made that typically when something goes into an exponential growth, sooner or later it runs into something that, because it can't, exponential stuff will go on to infinity. That can't happen. But at the point at which you begin to turn over, things typically very often go very unstable at that point mathematically. And so a clean turn down is one thing. We're liable to, as several people have said, we need to deal with, the change is going to happen. We need to deal with the change. We need to roll with the punches. We need to be, pay attention to what's going on and change how we need to react as things change. And I really like, there are a few examples given of good ways to do things. And we, in US, we will probably do something else, but Bhutan's doing a great job. Nice to hear Julia's take on it. I knew her, she was involved with a Buddhist group that was doing a series of conferences on empathy and compassion in society. And she gave a really, really moving and brilliant talked to that group once. And the other is the Nordic companies and countries and what they have been able to accomplish at a even at a cost of a high tax rate. And most Americans wouldn't put up with that. We need to change too. I think you, Ryan, Ted, the whole group that put this together did a terrific job of it, and it's really nice to see Donella get her due praises for all the work she did. And I also think it's really nice that the Club of Rome had finally broken away from old males and Europeans to the two pair of leaders we have now. Thank you, Mamphela, and to Sandrine as well for taking us in a new direction, leading a little more by the heart than by the head. So thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. Carolina, would you like to make a statement on behalf? She is in a systems analysis group of women, which is taken from the Sustainability Institute with Meadows, and is having a series of interesting webinars about Donella Meadows. Carolina, would you like to say something?
Thank you so much for the invitation. First of all, I'd really like to say that it has been truly uplifting to join this event and see the amazing, outstanding work that everyone here is doing, especially as a member of the younger generations. And if there's any way that I can help bring more of the younger generations to see this work and facilitate those intergenerational dialogues as well. Yes, I met Anitra through one of our Women in Systems Thinking speaker series conversations, a group that I started with two friends from the US. We are trying to elevate the work of women in systems thinking, and we started the conversations about elevating the work of Donella Meadows, as she was pivotal for this work. Sorry, I'm a little bit, I didn't prepare anything, but thank you so much for inviting me. And I think there's wonderful women here. I'd like to compliment the work of Mamphela and also of Anitra and Marilyn, and all the women that presented here today. Julia, thank you so much. And I'd love to have a conversation about inviting you onto the series and elevating your work. We need to bring our voices together. Thank you, everyone.
Good. We will. So we Marilyn, did you? What?
I just wanted to talk to something that Mamphela said about being indigenous again, because that touched me so much. We work closely at our school with the Hopi Reservation, and they allowed us to view Prophecy Rock. And on Prophecy Rock, it shows you the journey of mankind, whether you go this way to destruction or this way to regeneration. And it's a very powerful experience. And out of that, we wrote with them what's called the Earth Treaty, in which we've sent to numerous children, in which children have an opportunity, one to forgive themselves or their families for what they've done that they feel hasn't sustained the earth, and then make a pledge to Mother Earth for the work they're doing and going to do. And it has been so powerful to bring the indigenous energy and that specific love of systems thinking into their lives, and it's been life-changing. And I'd love to share that with people. And also I'd love to take people to the Hopi Reservation. It's the most powerful, incredible, wonderful group that I've worked with, and startling.
So I'm going to ask the Canadian club and then the Argentine club to make some thank yous. And then I'm going to thank the people who helped on the committee, as well as those who were the speakers. So if anyone wants to make a final point about substance, we're going into our final stage. But I see no hands up, so I'm going to call on Ted Manning, who's jumping at the bit because I left something out here in the middle of the program. Surprise, surprise. So Ted.
I'm gonna roll it in anyway, so that's all right. Canada, I'm happy to be here representing Canada, because Jean can't be here, and as she mentioned, her husband has COVID, so this has been a challenging time for all of us. Both travel, my own city is wrecked right now. They're trying to prepare it so we can get back power on, stuff like that. And this is just emblematic of why we're here. Every place in the world is being beset by things that they had not predicted. Some of us actually did, but most people didn't believe. And we are seeing the proof that while we may be a few decimal places off here and there, we were right. And I'm sorry, it's not nice to say that to some people, and it's politically incorrect, and I don't mind. Because I'm one of these old white guys, so I'm allowed to say, say politically incorrect things sometimes. Anyway, that said, Canada was the very first, along with Japan, country into a national association. So the Montebello sessions were held with our Prime Minister Trudeau. Rennie Whitehead was one of the founders working at it. We had about 5 or 6 Canadians in it, and we're still there, and we never went away. And we have a lot of people who've been doing good stuff, and we're still publishing things. For example, a group of us, along with our modeler, Rob Hoffman, have produced a thing called Pathways to Sustainability, which is based on a modeling procedure, based on a particular modeling procedure, and we are now influencing politicians in some way, not always as well as we would like. Some of the original people who were involved with us included Marilyn Trudeau, who actually funded the Canadian Association of the World, and we are trying to work our way back into the political fabric. Of course, we all understand how difficult that is when you're not coming with a bag of money. And that's one of the reasons why we are all so anxious to work on alternatives to money, on alternative values, on values that actually respect. Whenever we talk to our people, Indigenous or otherwise, they tell us whatever it is, the system's not working for us. And it's about time we actually created one we did. And that's another reason why several of us from Canada have bought into the well-being notion. The idea that if they only want to talk to us in money, we don't even want to talk. We would like to have another language that in fact could inspire better solutions, better ideas, and at the very least, better cooperation like what we've been able to do through Voyaging. So I am delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be one of the people spawned by limits to growth my entire career, and that of several of my colleagues wouldn't have happened for them. So we were running around the world teaching human biosphere relationships, human geography, risk management. Yeah, that's where it came from. So thank you very much for asking me to say.
Sylvia, we are ready for your thing, your praise song.
Thank you, Anitra. Well, you know, the only thing that I can say is very clear. It has been so inspiring. And what I want to highlight is the fact what I feel from my feeling. I feel that the Club of Rome, listening to Mamphela, listening to you, is getting into a humanistic way. That is what I always thought was lacking. The humanistic dimension that is the most important, because the first thing that must be regenerated is the human being, is each one of us. So thank you so much. It has been inspiring. Marilyn has been inspiring as usual. John Gilmore has been inspiring. I'm so happy to being able to participate today of this meeting. And I would like to thank Mamphela, thank you, Anitra. And I will come back to one of my loves, to Walt Whitman, to his words that I mentioned today. And I would say that at the end of this day, well, I think that we have grown a little together, that we have risen our dreams again, and that certainly we end the day being very happy. Thank you.
So I'd like to begin by thanking Mamphela about thinking about us when Harvard said, come and be our public health commencement speaker. But she thought about us, and we are the beneficiaries and the honored and happy warriors here, trying to pay tribute to both she and Dana Meadows, who is such a close fit that it wasn't difficult to talk about both of them in the same breath, in fact. But I'd like to thank everybody who helped put this event together. Marilyn Mosely, who got with love from her grandson COVID, who's sitting there isolated in her Ojai house. Brian Jackson, who's here with his angel new wife, Angela, who helped us too. And Bobby Gibbs, who was extremely helpful. John Gilmore, Ted Manning, who mobilized the Canadians tremendously for us, Brett Raphael, board member, John Fullerton, Gerardo, and Sylvia, the chairs and presidents of the the Mexican and the Argentine club. And then thanks to all the people who recorded, such as Barry Hughes, Jerry Glenn, Jerome Clayton Glenn, who puts out the State of the Future every year, John Richardson, a dear friend of Donella Meadows, and Hunter Lovins, a good friend, Sandrine and Carlos, who are co-president and treasurer secretary. Yes. And Gerardo made a statement, Gonzalo, and we want to thank Robert Hoffman for attempting to make a statement, which Jean Doherty and Ted over, and dear Hazel, our sister, who has become virtual, which is her own words, and I think it's so good because we can remember her now virtually, saying all these nasty things about Aurelio Pache. And Keith Suter, who was very helpful too, as well as, of course, Dennis Meadows, who did the original talk and was very generous in his praise of what Dana did for the limits of growth. I think we've all matured to the realization, and she wrote the book. So we're very grateful for everyone's help putting this wonderful celebration of both Mamphela and Dana together, and the celebration that this all happened in Boston.
Let me just thank a friend who hosted me and made it possible for me to give my roots to the we call each other Anamkara, an Irish expression for dear friend. And she hosted me so that I would break my trip and get ready for it.
Yes, Marguerite Calloway. She's here.
Yeah.
In Santa Rosa, California.
Absolutely.
Hello to Marguerite. So thank you to everyone, and we will, Ryan, do you want to tell them what will happen now with this? It'll be on our website.
Yeah, I will go through these videos and try to get them posted to our website soon, and to YouTube. We have a YouTube channel with quite a few videos from all of the Voyagers group presentations.
Because you are absolutely amazing, Brian. I feel guilty about Ryan because I kind of pleaded with him on my knees on a telephone call. And he said, yes, I will serve as the chair of the nominations committee. His fault. If you feel a little bit like you're getting to be a minority, Ted, just lay it.
Ryan actually colluded to get me back on. So so I'm still talking to him.
So I want to thank everybody for hanging in there till what is not the bitter end, what is the hopeful end, and the pathway forward. And the view that hundreds of thousands, millions of people are seeing a view of well-being and are discarding this very distasteful and degrading rush after monetary accumulation. Whoever dies with most toys wins is no longer fashionable, but who dies with the most well-being that they've done for other people and most Ubuntu wins.
You're an absolute force of nature.
So, Brian, I think we can turn it off.
All right.
Bye-bye.